Woo! It's the Biblical Rogues Gallery with only 3 rogues tonight because everyone decided to chicken out. They didn't want to start any wars online, so they decided to duck out of a very, very controversial topic because everyone debates 2 to 3 of the verses that we're going to read tonight anyway. We're in Romans chapter 8. Woohoo! Yeah. Everyone loves Romans chapter 8. Leighton, you wrote a book on Romans chapter 9, which we'll get to in 2 weeks, I suppose. But
actually, the book does start in Romans 8:28. So I do pick up there before leading into Romans 9. So I do hit on this.
The Potter's Promise. I don't remember that, but
I do.
Yeah.
I paid attention when I read it.
Oh, really?
Jonathan has it beside his toilet just in case he runs out of toilet paper. That's what he told me.
Bridget is still at. Look, this is. If you had an office like mine, you would never leave it. Okay.
You do have a cool office.
Yeah, you finally got to see it, and you know what I'm talking about. This office is great.
Huge one.
Yeah,
it's got a lot of books. It's like a library, and then it's also got a huge view over the lake, the river, actually there. And
yeah, the nastiest river in the United States of America.
Well, you can't tell that from where you are, though. It just looks like
you can. That's why I keep my blinds closed.
I was about to ask. I was like, is that why the blinds are shut?
Look, I'm from Arkansas, and I know that the Arkansas River is like the butt of the Mississippi River, where all the stuff is expelled in. But even that is better than this Ohio River. Which also, when you look out on the river from my office, you see the industrial plants that dump all kinds of stuff that make the catfish have 3 eyes. And it's not pretty. It's not pretty. But anyway, yeah. So tonight we're doing Romans 8. I've got a clip set up from a recent debate. We've been covering the debate between Dr. James White and Tim Barber, and Romans 8:28 came up in an alternative interpretation that Dr. White was unfamiliar with. So we'll get into that. And I think Tim Barber was referencing a N.T. Wright translation from a book. But I've known about this alternative translation for going on 40 years now. So it's not new.
you know it when you were 2?
No, I'm 47, so that was.
Oh, 8. You know, as 7. You know it when you were 7. Okay, yeah.
Well, I've known it's been around for a while because as we'll get to shortly, I'll show you. Here's a comment worth putting up on board before we go. Hey, Pritchett's Razorbacks are going to have to play Texas and Oklahoma soon. You know, it was great. I went to a unapologetics conference that Texas Baptist puts on. Leighton was there. Eric Hernandez invited me to go speak. And that year, the Razorbacks beat every Texas team on the schedule, and I made sure and pointed it out to make sure the crowd hated me before I started. It worked, too. But, yeah. Yeah, Braxton says, glad everyone Nick said he might join us. Tim Barber, we're just talking about the Barber debate, but he's not coming either. I don't know where MJ is. I don't know where Alex is. I know Junior's at work, but who cares?
I really thought this would be the one that we'd have a packed house.
Yeah, I mean, Idol Killer's like, I'll show up. I mean, of course, they can show up at any time, and I'll put them in. They don't have to show up at the very beginning. Everyone knows that. That's fine. But we've got a lot to talk about. Maybe this will be a shorter show without everyone. Yeah, Derek needs to start going. Derek's a permanent fixture now. He needs to come on. And I'm making Leighton Flowers be here for the next few weeks because he works for me. So he has to do what I say. But, I mean, he wrote a book on Romans 9, so we're probably going to plug the book. Well, of course, we'll plug it next week because he starts in whereabouts in Romans 8? I can't remember. It's been so
Romans 8:28.
Mm-hmm.
So you start at 20, but we're going to start at verse 26. That's where we left off. So I'll read for us tonight. Interesting stuff in 26 and 27. They don't need to just rush too far past it. But Romans 8:26-30 from the NASB. Now, in the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we should. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. and he who searches the heart knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. All right, so let's get into it. A lot of stuff here about the Holy Spirit interceding for us. What does that mean? The Spirit himself intercedes for us because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. Interesting things about what is this groanings too deep for words. If there's some debate on that. But verse 26, the Holy Spirit helps in our weakness. What is the weakness? Y'all have any thoughts on what the weakness is?
Well, I'm going to assume it has to do with what came before regarding there's the groaning of creation, and this is all in the context of what the Holy Spirit is doing for us, and like Paul's building his case, and we talked about it last week, and that's why I thought it made more sense to stop on 26 last week. But you have 3 different groanings, and this is kind of going right along the same lines as those.
Yeah, you did a commentary of sorts on this. Helps in our weakness because we don't know what to pray for as we should, which I'm not surprised Paul would have to write that to Pauline churches. I mean, if it was Peter writing his churches, it'd be different. But Paul, I'm just kidding. We don't know how to. I mean, just as an aside, I always know what I want to pray for. I don't necessarily know that is what I should pray for. So that's kind of a personal aside.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the flesh that it talks about, earlier in the chapter, it talks about us eagerly awaiting for the adoption of our bodies and our flesh, and Paul, of course, chapter 7 talks about woe is me, this flesh, this body of death that I carry. And so I think that's the weakness he's talking about, that when you're in your flesh and you don't even know sometimes what to pray or how to pray it because you're in such deep grief or sorrow or just confusion about whatever's happening in your world. And I think all of us can relate to that. And so I think that's what Paul is really talking about. When you just don't know what to pray, the Holy Spirit steps in and helps. And that's, I think, a comfort as well.
Yeah, it's kind of what Derek was saying. We've got all these things going on as we are. If you go back to last week's show, we are believers in the midst of this. You've got an already, you've got a not yet, you've got all of creation itself groaning, and we talked about whether or not that was the creature of the creation, and we decided, I think we all agreed that was the creation.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, those of us who are live by the Spirit were crying out to God, and that's predicated on the fact that if indeed we suffer with Him, so that we may be glorified with Him, and all of that. Stenogmois or stenogmos, but it's moist in the sentence. This groanings, there's some debate. Cosman says this, but more contemporary to that would be like, what's the God's empowering presence. Gordon Fee, thank you, Brain, for being late. Gordon Fee actually argues extensively for this view that this would be a passage, this type of groanings, that would be those kind of ecstatic type utterances, speaking in tongues here. That I guess if you were to punt to 1 Corinthians, that would be like an angelic language. Now, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that. I have plenty, but I'll see if y'all have any idea what you think about these inexpressible groanings.
David Guzik also alludes to that. He doesn't limit it to the ecstatic tongue speaking, but he is open to that being in view here. Me personally, I don't even think we need to get into a review of tongues to talk about this, but I don't see this as a proof text for that, mainly because the like I said, there's three groanings: the creation groans, then we groan, and then this is the spirit, like the inexpressible groanings of the spirit. And so I would feel like if it's us speaking in tongues, however you want to define that, that would be more so our groaning, not with the spirit here. And not only that, we're talking about speaking in tongues, and I believe the word there basically means speechless. So I don't see how that would be a proof text. Plus, I think the following verse kind of puts it into its context. What does it say? And he who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So I think that's just saying that the Spirit knows what to pray on our behalf.
Yeah, see, I think Fee probably gave as good of an apologetic as you can offer for this, and I still wasn't convinced. Now, I say that I'm not convinced as one who thinks that when it comes to speaking in tongues, which I agree this is not talking about, you could go watch a debate with me and Braxton where I take the extreme minority view that 100% of speaking in tongues in the Bible, glossolalia, is all 100% of it is ecstatic utterances. And you can go hear my arguments for that. And not even Keener wants a piece of that. Not even Witherington, who's, these guys who are moderates. We make room for both speaking actual languages versus no. In Acts, I take the extreme view, the extreme minority view that only the looniest of charismatics take, that I think that it was all ecstatic utterances. And I still don't think that this is a proof text for that.
Don't you take the view that I think it's called achalalia, where it's not so much that the speech is the speech is ecstatic, but they're speaking one language and they happen to hear it in their language, like it's
there's a miracle of hearing too. Dunn would probably be one of the few contemporary scholars that's more mainstream. Jimmy Dunn, he wrote a commentary on Romans. I have to look at his commentary to see what he said about this, but doesn't matter.
I throw David Guzik in there as well.
Yeah,
I've read him on 1 Corinthians 14, and that's how he sees it too.
He's like, well, in Acts, they're like, yeah, but it says dialects and all this. It's like, yeah. We talked about Hengel last week, and I'll just give my brief explanation for those who are curious and don't want to go watch another video. We talked about Hengel's, recasting Jerusalem and Galilee even as, cosmopolitan, very Greek. And when John MacArthur, believe it or not, when he's blasting the charismatics for the ecstatic utterances, he is saying that goes all the way back to the 1st century because it's a pagan counterfeit, right? But he doesn't really, he gets nervous when you do any sort of parallelism because he thinks it's all either parallelomania or parallel. But I put him in the parallelophobia because he thinks it's all parallel. So, I said that's precisely the point. This is the real deal, but it's still, no one in Jerusalem speaking most people were bi or trilingual anyway. So people at 9 o'clock in the morning speaking languages they already probably know, because most people outside of America know more than one language, or in the modern world. We're the only ones.
I'm curious. Yeah. I didn't study the original language on the word groans or moans or sighs or whatever, because I've never even considered this being about tongues. I've always considered it to be about the suffering. And I know I've been at this place a few times in my life where it's just like, well, if you've ever preached a funeral and you've seen a mother cry over their child who died or something like that, and you just see this guttural pain just coming from them, and they're just moaning and then just in utter grief. There's been very few times, thankfully, in my life that I've had those kinds of moments. But that's what comes to my mind when I hear these words. I don't even think about the languages, glossolalia, the concept of intelligible speech that people are understanding. It seems to me to be coming across as just a a guttural moan in suffering, like a hurt.
Well, I mean,
and so that's the way I've always taken it.
But Toys is inexpressible or too deep for words, and so this is really the Spirit is making intercession with things that are just, too much to communicate openly. I think Derek was hinting to this earlier, so I think that goes to just the inexpressibility of something. Trying to communicate this idea that the Spirit is interceding us with his own groanings that are just beyond audibility for us, So I don't see it as trying to communicate in any kind of language, whether it's angelic, languages or whatever, because it just seems to be the idea of groaning anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Nick put sighs here in the. Which means he read some commentary that no one else has bothered to read in 30 years, and thinks that there's something that might be to that. Doing prefixes throughout Romans 8 is intriguing, suggests human agency alongside divine activity. Yeah, we're going to get into that. What does mind refer to? Who is the one who searches the mind? For me, I would say God the Father is the agent. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit. I would say that would be the Father who searches or knows the mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it would seem weird to say that, to imply that the Spirit searches our hearts, knows the mind of the Spirit. Like the Spirit knows his own mind in searching our heart. That seems weird. Seems weird to think it's the Son. So I go with God the Father on that. But there is some discussion about that, actually.
Well, because later on in Romans 8, it does talk about the Son interceding for us, right?
Yeah, and you can punt to Hebrews 7:25. Nick's here. He's going to set us all straight on all of this. And Junior's here.
Nice.
Junior's off work.
Nice.
He's at work.
It's a party now.
Yeah, Junior's. Are you at work, Junior? Or are you home now?
Oh, I'm at work.
Oh yeah. See, you do what I do. Anything but work at work.
Yeah, right. Hopefully this I'm doing social work, and so hopefully the young adult is tucked in bed, so you're gonna hear us talking about theology and come downstairs. Yeah.
All right, so Nick, groans or sighs, and who do you think's doing the searching?
I have no idea. I was hoping y'all would know. And hi, everyone.
Hey, Nick.
My vote is the Spirit. I mean, my vote is God the Father. Leighton, where are you at on that?
Yeah, that's kind of where I am too. I because the Spirit is doing the interceding. He's the Spirit is the one who residing in us is knowing what we need from our groans and our moans. He knows what we need, so he's speaking on our behalf to the Father, I guess is the way I would take it.
Yeah, I mean, the Son intercedes for us with the Father, the Spirit interceding here. It makes sense it's with the Father. The Father is the one who searches, who knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Father and the Spirit are one, just like the Father and the Son are one. You would have, again, you would have to have a doctrine of the Trinity based on certain things that Paul says without, councils and all of that. But so Derek, were you on Team God or Team someone else?
No, when I went over this, I thought,
Team Father or Team other person. Yeah,
I knew what you meant. Yeah, no, I saw that as the Father, and just I kind of wondered if there was a Trinitarian aspect to that, where you have the Spirit interceding to the Father here, and then you have later in verse 30 something. I should have been ready for that. Whenever the Son is interceding for us, so then it makes me wonder.
34.
Yeah, so there's one of the Trinitarian formulas where there is the God the Father up at the top, and then you have the Son and the Spirit, not like the triangle, but where I think it's like the patriarchal view of the Trinity. where both are like the Son and the Spirit are kind of like, you know what I'm talking about? I don't want to keep babbling and embarrassing myself, but you have the Father up at the top. I think it's the Eastern.
Or the monarchianism view of the Trinity, something like that.
Yeah, the subordinationism. That is the one I was talking about. So that's a tangent, but I mean, I did feel like it was worth mentioning just because you do have both of those. You have the Spirit going to the Father in intercession. You have the Son going to the Father in intercession. So
Looking at the passage again, and sorry, it's been a Hades of a week, but I'm wondering if you could argue that, and just so I'm tracking with you, we're talking about 27, right? Verse 27, that's where we are specifically. I don't have that wrong.
You're correct.
Okay, so the one searching, go ahead.
Oh, just to clarify for Days of Isaiah, Days of Elijah, and anyone else tuning in tonight because of the thumbnail, this is a show that has gone through the entire book of Romans. We're going pericope by pericope. And so, yes, we are going to get into that. It is a long show, even longer with Leighton Flowers on it. We do Superiology 101.
What are you trying to say? I'm long-winded? Or is that what you're trying to say, Pritchett? Just come out and say it.
You're just going.
You inspire all of us to be long-winded. That's how that works.
Pritchett, I feel like it's worth mentioning that we have triple the audience watching as we normally do. So there's definitely interest.
Yeah, it's because Leighton's here.
And no, it's black magic. You put predestination on the
yeah. Well, it's gonna be well worth it. It's gonna be well worth it when we get to it.
I wonder if you could argue that the one who searches, why can't that be us? Because if you think about it, the one who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit. So we're not talking about the Spirit doing that. We're not even necessarily having to talk about the Father doing that. You could argue that the one searching hearts, you could use it paraphrasing, searching your heart.
Yeah, I kind of go with Schreiner here, but I mean that reading, Schreiner does interact with that in his commentary, because those who want to point out about the mindset on the Spirit have their, those who live according to the Spirit have their mind set on the things of the Spirit. And that's why they know in verse 27, knows the mind of the Spirit, that he, the he being us who follow the Spirit know the mind of the Spirit. So that would be in verse 27, if we're searching our own hearts. But I think Schreiner's right that, one who searches, I would say we need that singular.
You're underwater, Pritchett.
Okay, we would need that to be, can you hear me now? God is, I'd have to get the commentary off for the cross-reference for God searching hearts, but because it just seems like Paul would say something, the one now searching, it seems like Cardia would be singular then, searching your own heart or something. I don't know.
I mean, it's an idea. I think it's ambiguous intentionally, but it's the mind of the Spirit. So if now the one searching hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit. So
this is the problem
on the Spirit. This is the Spirit's well, depending on how you take the gender, but it's probably a reference to the Spirit's own mind, or even you could argue that the mind that is governed by the Spirit. Think of verses 1 through 11. And putting to death the deeds of the body, being guided by the Spirit. So already you have human agency is at least involved in this process somewhat. So you could argue the one searching hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is because you already have the mind of the Spirit, and that sort of stuff. So I'm just making a more complex problem.
Yeah, yes, you are, because this is what you Pauline people do, and Pauline commentators and Pauline scholars do, is they throw out phrases like it's intentionally ambiguous. You probably got that from 19 different commentaries who talk in this language that Paul is leaving it open or something. That is not helpful. This is why Peter called Paul out and said, some of this stuff's hard to understand because Paul doesn't say anything clear like Peter does. The gruff fisherman knows how to communicate. This philosopher here. Yeah, in Arkansas, we go bass fishing. We go trout fishing. We fish for catfish.
You're fishing for something right now.
Yeah, we're Peter fans. Paul, he's like, oh, Mr. Nuance. I'm going to leave it vague, so let the reader. No,
Yeah,
Phoebe
but,
was there to answer questions. She had to have an answer, and I doubt Phoebe's answer to the congregation.
Yeah, and she probably gave
Paul
them an
mentioned
answer.
ambiguously. No way that happened. No way.
Are we done?
Okay,
Did
rant
you get
over.
that out of your system? Do you feel better? Do you need to go for a run? You need a cigarette? You
I don't run. That's for Derek. I pedal under my station for my cardio.
So the one who searches hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit, and then you have to supply is. But for the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So I don't know why you couldn't at least have, I call it an expanded referent there. Specifically, the one making intercession is for us, not in substitution of us, but for our benefit. The one doing this for our benefit is in relation to those who search hearts. And so I don't know why you can't have both that. I think synergistically that makes complete sense of the entire passage. It could just also be the Father, and that's entirely fine too. But I think given that Paul's emphasis on the human person and how they act is quite interesting. And I think I'd like to see more than what Schreiner offers, and minus your rant and all of that stuff too.
Well, Schreiner says the same. Even though he's a Calvinist, he's a Baptist. So, but he says. I went and got the Schreiner, our favorite Calvinist commentator. I like Schreiner.
No, don't you put those words in our mouths. Cranfield is our favorite Calvinist commentator.
Fair enough. But here's what I like about Schreiner. Schreiner is fair. And in fact, he's so fair that after he provides everyone else's interpretation, you wonder why he thinks what he thinks, because he argues for his worse.
That's Jimmy Dunn, too, by the way.
He argues for his own position worse, and he defends everyone else, which I got to respect that.
Yeah, take the
Moo is the same way, in my opinion. Moo is a little bit like that, too.
Oh, but Moo's over. I think Moo's commentary on Romans is way overrated. Schreiner's is not. Schreiner's is good if you want theological debates on everything. He's still a theologian wearing exegete garments, but he's still a theologian more so than a biblical scholar. But anyway, he says the one who searches hearts is not the Spirit, but God the Father. And he references 1 Chronicles 28:9, 29:17, Psalm 7:9, 139:1, 139:23, and Jeremiah 17:10. He is the one who discerns the groanings in the hearts of believers and discerns in them the mind of the Spirit.
Determines.
No, he said, and discerns in them the mind of the Spirit, not determines. No, his commentary on Romans 9 he talks about compatibilism, which he's obviously.
So that means he determines what he discerns.
Yeah.
So that all makes perfect sense.
He uses the word. He talks about compatibilism in his exegesis of Romans 9. I'm going to point that out. That Thomas Schreiner, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary Calvinist professor with a Romans commentary, he had to change because N.T. Wright convinced him he was wrong on Romans chapter 2. Anyway, besides that. Who says that, Pelagius was probably right, but we can still salvage Augustine so that we don't have to pretend. Read it, chapter, anyway, that's tangent. Go read this. That's why everyone should own Tom. If you want a commentary on Romans from a Calvinist, get this one. It's you'll have all kinds of fun with it. There's all kinds
Cranfield is better, and so is Bart. Just read Bart.
Yeah, but it's not fun for the people in the soteriology debates. This is a fun one because.
Are you kidding me? Bart started that, dude. That's Bart.
I didn't find Pipers too convincing.
No, but the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary's esteemed biblical scholar, Pauline scholar Thomas Schreiner is talking about man's philosophy in Romans chapter 9 for all the Calvinists that boo-hoo and poo-poo on man's philosophy. There's compatibilism is talked about here. So what we would talk about, we'll get there anyway.
Well, to go back to what we were talking about regarding who is this that is searching the hearts. Schreiner already referenced Psalm 139:1. Oh Lord, you have searched me and know me. Jeremiah 17:10. I, the Lord, search the heart. I examine the mind to reward a man according to his way.
Yep, that one too.
And then there was what stuck out to me was 1 Kings 8:39 during Solomon's prayer. He said, the latter half of the verse. He says, according to all their ways, since you know each heart, for you alone know every human heart. So I'm willing to entertain a case for something other than other than God the Father, but that's why I stand there.
It's a big mountain to travail for me, because I mean, you know, it's plural. God, the Old Testament background here about searching hearts, echoing there. If Joel was here tonight, he said he was going to be here, but he didn't. Dr. Kirko.
Well, this should be easy to figure out, Nick. Just look and see if Paul capitalized the word he.
Yeah, he would tell us. Yeah, yeah. Joel would tell us if what the Septuagint echoes of searching the hearts. He would know all of that by memory, or at least by preparation, and be able to tell us why even Calvinists like Thomas Schreiner are correct. But he didn't show up. Anyway.
So what about Revelation 2:23? If because all the Old Testament passages in regards to that, I'm not sure if this was brought up already, but where it says, you know, a bit grim here, but you know, I will kill her children with death. Well, I will kill her children with pestilence, and all the churches will know that I am he who searches the hearts and minds. So, in relation to Christ. So again, hashtag Pauline ambiguous. could be all three.
Well, and then you've got First Peter saying, trying to find out that, or is it inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. That sounds like a you problem, Pritchett.
Mm-hmm. We'll get to First Peter. Don't talk to me about First Peter,
because Peter didn't write it. I only go with what people actually wrote in the Bible.
Liberal.
Your mom.
Yeah, First Peter, the first sentence. I believe the Bible is inspired, authoritative, and inerrant.
I believe it's inerrant. Liberal.
Tells us that Peter wrote First Peter. I mean, Paul tells us he didn't write this business anyway. Tertius did, and I wonder.
Peter couldn't write real good.
I wonder if Tertius had to ask Paul's permission to say hi to people when we get there in chapter 16, which will be the most fun chapter that everyone skips, but we won't skip it because it's great. Yeah, so we're almost 35 minutes into it. Let's get into what everyone wants to talk about here. Everyone wants to know about Romans 8:28 through 30. And just to set this up, I'm going to play a clip for everyone's amusement. Okay.
Yay.
So here comes a clip from the debate between Dr. White and Tim Barber on Romans 8:28.
You read a prepared, I think you call it a translation of Romans 8:28. Would you be able to read that again, because I had never heard it before?
So you've had a debate, I think, with N.T. Wright, who translates it similarly. The rough way that could be diagrammed out, and if you would like for us to take time, we could. That passage could also be translated as, God works in all things with those who are called according to his purpose for good.
Okay. Do you happen, when you say you're diagramming out, can you actually read it yourself?
Can I read you? Okay, let me pull up the interlinear.
We don't need an interlinear. Can you actually read the Greek? It's a simple question because
You know what's great about interlinears? They have both the Greek and the English, and it's easier to pull up than like a Greek New Testament on a laptop, because you can just go to Bible Hub or whatever.
That's the most old man thing I've ever seen. Just listen here.
Yeah, I mean, why don't you have it already pulled up?
Why don't you have it memorized, young man?
This is just pure attempt at flex.
Yeah, now I love
flex.
You guys know that I love Dr. White. He is my friend, whom I encouraged to get back on the bike. But this was a little bit snotty, and because he said that while I was 40 minutes behind Leighton's debate, because I was talking to all of you guys, which was more fun than the debate Leighton was having with James White, there was no way I could communicate with Leighton to give him like the things that would have won the debate as much as I wanted to.
I mean, you weren't like Joe Biden having a thing in his ear and
right.
speaking to him during the debate.
So I wasn't actually sending him text, but since he came up with this weird conspiracy theory, I'm going to go ahead and say something a little bit snotty about my dear friend Dr. White, and that is there's a reason why he begged off, because he didn't he didn't know that Tim was more ready for it than he thought. But I'll let y'all decide. We'll let the audience decide.
It seems like it sounds like you're following someone else, and it looks like to me they are going with the textual variant between panta and pon. But if you can't read it, then I can't pursue this because you're just giving me what somebody else has said, and I can't cross-examine that.
Yeah, oidamen de hoti
no major
tois
difference
aga
between pon and
is it
panta,
posin or
but okay.
pasin? Posin in that spot. Ton theon panta,
Right.
synerge.
So what's panta?
Okay, so panta would be all things.
Okay, but how is it functioning in the sentence?
So it is well, I think it's an adjective. It's in that accusative, sort of a neuter plural.
Okay, so, all right. I don't think I can pursue that because it doesn't seem like you understand what I'm asking. So
It looks like you
move on
didn't
from
come prepared.
He didn't ask anything, but what I think I think he didn't expect Tim to be able to read that. So, but he didn't actually ask anything. But to steelman Dr. White, what I think he was going to ask is there is debate about panta, and he was going to ask about whether or not that was in the accusative or in the nominative, which means is it the subject of the sentence or is it a direct object? And if it is the direct object, then is he following a variant that has hatheos in it, which Nick is going to shill for as that would be the subject. So it's just kind of this text is actually a mess. But Dr. White did say something that he had never heard of this before, and I wanted to show everybody a picture. The reason why I had heard of this is a picture of a NIV study Bible from 1985, almost 40 years ago, which means that the scholar translators who were putting this together predated 40 years ago. So it's even older than that. If you make note of K there on 28, or works together with those who love him to bring about what is good. This is a similar alternative translation to the one Tim made. Now, it's not identical to the one that Tim made, but this idea that it is God who works together with those who love him to bring about what is good. This is not just N.T. Wright saying this in a book that came out a few years ago. This is not something that was made. This is something that goes back over 40 years, at least. Probably longer than that, but who knows? But this is the oldest reference I could find to that in what I had available to me. So I took a picture of this to show everybody in our group as soon as they made a kerfluffle about this. But okay, so if panta is in the accusative, that means it is a direct object. If it is in the nominative, that means it would be the subject of the sentence. And the only way it would be the subject of the sentence is if hatheos is not in the sentence in the original, even though it shows up in a variant. Are we all on the same page? Probably not, but there you go. And I will let Nick explain this far more complicated or easier than I did, depending on who you are. You're muted, Nick.
Muted.
And I didn't mute you.
I think he's talking to the missus.
I think he has to. Yeah, he had to step off the screen.
So he is not going to explain that. Okay.
Oh, something came up. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, I don't want to do any hard work. Okay, so the insertion of God as the subject of the verb to work, the synerge would be the verb here. That is found.
Okay.
Oh, he's back.
Sorry about that.
Explain to
Sorry,
people
yeah,
what
okay.
where hatheos, the variant.
Hatheos.
Yeah.
After the verb cooperative or working together. So you have, I can't show it to you, but if you imagine it in Greek, if I render it just line, word, right? You've got we know, but that, or therefore, the ones who love God all things work together for good. If you took it just straight like that. Synerge, where works is, has hatheos following it. I think it's following it or before it. I can't remember exactly. And the issue is they're trying to later translators are trying to clarify who the subject of the verb is to work with or to cooperate with. And you see that in P46, which is 3rd century, which is a really good manuscript. The earlier the manuscript, the better it is. And then you have Vaticanus, which is B, 4th century, and then you have Alexandrinus in 5th century. So those are the main references or the main witnesses that insert God as the subject of synergeo. The manuscripts that lack it, and so we'll call that reading A just for simplicity. So God A, not God B. The manuscripts that lack God, you have Sinaiticus, 4th century, good manuscript. C, and then you have the Western text D, F, and G, and then 33 in the 9th century. So the weight of the evidence in terms of actual manuscript count does favor the B reading, the not having God in there. The fact is that you have P46 and Vaticanus in there. When Vaticanus and Sinaiticus differ, that's interesting too. But P46 and Vaticanus do include God as the subject. The weight, most translations English translations, do seem to insert to go with reading A and put it in, but not exhaustively so. So I think the evidence does slightly favor the A reading, but not decisively. And so that's kind of the text critical issue is you could argue that God is the implied subject of works with or working with, but it's not immediate. And it would make more sense. And even some scribes have argued that panta and pneuma were mixed up in the text critical issues later on, and that sort of thing. Robert Jewett has a really interesting discussion on that maybe some early writers maybe meant to write pneuma rather than panta. Probably not true, but it's interesting, which tells us that this passage, when our beloved, wonderful, God-fearing Calvinist brothers and sisters quote it in English to us to make a point, not to bring another debate in, but it's kind of like quoting 1 Timothy 2:12 in English and not doing any of your homework about what the verse actually seems to be saying, what the disputes are. And so this is a text critical issue that needs to be solved. I'm not intending for us to solve it here. My sense is it's probably the A reading is probably correct, but not so much that I can say yes. The issue then becomes what happens if A reading is true, and what happens if B reading is true. Does that make sense? Can I get we're at least all kind of tracking on that?
It's even more complicated than that.
Okay. So then
I was going to say,
I tried to make it simple for us, Bridge. I'm stupid.
But then someone like Mounts, who writes textbooks for basics of biblical Greek, he goes with the B reading, but then he says, agapos and tante on would be you take that as the implied subject, and demands that panta be in the accusative, because it just, even without paltheos being the subject of the sentence, all things can't be the subject. That all things somehow mysteriously just work together.
Right. Well, and that's what Robert Jewett used. I think he quoted what was the name of the person? It was like C.H. Dodd, and I'm going from memory, but in his commentary, it's something along the lines of that the world has kind of a natural tendency towards progress. That kind of you almost might say the divine watchmaker kind of things just kind of work out this way. You know what I mean? That to quote Martin Luther King Jr., our favorite American Baptist, the natural arc of history is towards justice. So there. But I don't buy that sort of mentality. I don't think Panta fits that. And furthermore, if you bring the PowerPoint back up, Pritchett, I don't think God, or at least the Father, as we often refer to him, is the actor who's doing the synergeo, I think. Because then you have to ask who is the subject of the one who works all things? Because that will determine how you read the passage. Is it all things, as Pritchett mentioned, Panta being the implied subject, which I don't think makes grammatical sense. Is it God, which we might say the Father, probably to be more precise? Or is it, my reading is, and it turns out Jewett agrees with me, I just looked, the Spirit. The Spirit works all things together with those who love God for good.
Make your case.
That's a big debate to be had.
Make your case, because I'm not on board with that.
Well, as a Greek expert, as you know, I'll happily,
as Jewett is more so than Quint, but
Well, yeah. Why would I write a commentary? There's no money in it. So sooner get here. I would okay. I hear you. I hear you fomenting, Pritchett. Go ahead.
No, okay.
Well, Gungus moving in the background. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to say, let's. The spirit is still God, so that's fine. But I still think it's just God, because if Hotheos is, if the A reading is fine, then that is nominative. Obviously, that's the subject of the sentence. So
but
God
is not indistinguishable, or God is broad. Which person are we talking about? Because Paul will call Jesus God, I would argue, in Romans 9:5.
I agree.
And so you can't just say God as if that solves anything. It's like when we didn't talk about this because I wasn't really here for it last week. When we talked about divine passives, the one subjecting creation last week, to futility. It's like, well, what's a divine passive? And I'm like, that tells me literally nothing. A car drove down the road. Who drove it? Well, a car drove down the road. Okay, that doesn't tell me anything. Who drove the car? And so here, just saying God doesn't solve the issue. Because we need to talk about, are we talking about Father, Son, or Spirit? Or is Paul being intentionally ambiguous and doesn't know what he's saying? So I would argue that given the, I think there are nine verbs with the soon prefix, that is the with or cooperative prefix, throughout the entire pericope. I think it makes good sense that the Spirit is the one who's been doing this with those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, but also throughout the entire passage. The closest you get is co-heirs with Christ. But how do you get into that? The first 13 verses or so are Spirit-led, putting to death the deeds of the body. If you do that with the Spirit, you will live. And so I think there is really no reason for the redundancy of the Father working all things together for those who love him. It seems redundant given the passage. And specifically, the one who's been active in the previous two verses doing everything is the Holy Spirit. And so even if you want to argue for the A reading, that is an implicit argument that the Spirit is being called God here.
Yeah.
Which I think
just
is
to be
quite
clear to our audience, Synergeho and Synerge
work together.
Means works together. It is Synergeo, just the lexi, is where we get the word synergy or synergism.
Paul will use it to describe co-workers, people that work with him, labor alongside in harmony and participation for the gospel.
1 Corinthians 16:16.
Yep. And this verb occurs in the context of agents working together for a purpose.
With God and 2 Corinthians,
God, yeah.
2 Corinthians 6:1 with God, people working together with each other, or Paul, 1 Corinthians 16:16.
So let me try this, Pritchett. I think this.
The Lord worked with them. Mark, even though this is not
likewise,
original.
The Spirit helps us in our weakness. Oh my goodness, it's like you're from Arkansas, not from California. You think the liberal kid in California is going to shut up? I'm going to keep going. So likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought. I'm reading from the ESV. I'll just keep going. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, the Spirit works all things together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Does that fit from a literary and contextual standpoint? Surely it does. Surely. It's not unreasonable or even unpreferable to have that reading, given Paul's very strong pneumatology, not only in Romans 8, but 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, as the divine distributor of gifts.
So here's my
aspect too. Saying it's God doesn't solve the issue.
When I first came across this in the NIV Bible, I love the idea of God works together with those who love him to bring about the good in all things, or whatever. The alternative reading to me, whether it's the NIV or the way NP Wright and Barber were shaking out, I love it. Here's the problem. Here's my problem. And no, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the New Testament usage is always persons working together with persons, or if you go to James 2:24, which nobody wants to talk about, and James 2:22, faith working together with works. But still, you have faith and works like working together with like, right? Just like with all the references in the Pauline literature and the longer ending of Mark, you have persons, whether it's God and humans or human and humans, it's like persons working with like persons, or like things like faith working with a thing like works. The only problem that could come up is in Second Maccabees. I can't remember where it talks about people working together with the darkness of the nighttime to do a raid. So depending on where you date that, but it still seems like the overwhelming usage of Synergeho is the same kind of things working together, whether it's thing and thing or person and person, except for that weird usage in Second Maccabees. So I'm all in favor of that. Or and the longer ending in Mark. 16:20. Okay, but in Romans 8:28, tois agaposin ton theon is towards agaposin is dative, which means this is an indirect object of the verb, not the direct object of the verb, which means
the dative describes the relationship. And so the dative
yeah,
tells
like they
us,
are the beneficiaries of something.
Are we talking?
They are the
Not necessarily.
recipients
That
or
needs to be argued
beneficiaries of whatever the subject, verb, and direct object are doing.
So how does that happen with a verb that denotes cooperation, specifically with tois agaposin or tois agaposi? So there are different types of datives. You have datives of benefit. You also have datives of advantage. You have different types of datives. Now,
yeah, beneficiary covers both.
It's our reading, but you need to argue for that.
Okay, so if you're taking B and God is nowhere in that, you still have the debate whether all things is in the accusative or the nominative. So you have the debate whether or not, even without patheos, you have the debate of whether or not all things is the subject of this phrase or clause, or it's just an adjective functioning as an object. So it's weird.
Tois agaposi is a verb. It functions more like a verbal noun. Specifically,
those are participles, and if you watch James White's debate with Leighton Flowers, everyone knows what a participle is.
So what?
Tois agaposin are participles.
It looks like a substantival participle, which means it's functioning like a noun, but there's a verbal component because it tells us about the agency of the actors. God works all things together, and then
functioning like an adjective, not a noun.
Wait, say that again.
These participles are functioning as an adjective to describe those toys, the God-loving ones.
Those is a noun. No, you got it backwards. The
right.
ones. So okay, you need to ask the question.
Agaposin
is a specific select idiom that describes a corporate group
that's a participle
that is already doing something.
It's the loving God ones.
Yes, okay, Pritchett. When you have a definite article with a participle, that functions as what's called the substantival participle. That basically tells these are nouns. These function like nouns. They act like nouns. They're not adjectives. They're adjectives if we want to use the language of there's something within the noun that's self-descriptive and we can read from it, but it's more like it tells us that these are the ones who love God. They're defined more as a noun or corporate group. And so
like my favorite movie
God
with
is
a
working
participle
together with these who are already acting.
Yeah, that's like my favorite. A participle is a verb that's used as an adjective. Okay, so like my favorite movie with a participle is The Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger. That the remake will be terrible, but the running. So it's a verb used as an adjective to describe something. These are agaposin is describing those who love. They are lovers of God. So you can translate it. You can translate it loving lovers, those lovers of God, instead of those loving God. But it's still indirect object.
Sure,
so,
that's not. No one's disputing that. It's a dative.
Right.
It's a participle. It's a substantival participle, which means we're talking. It functions like a noun in the sentence. You can
Say that
argue that
again.
it has a result of a substantival participle functions like a noun in the sentence.
Okay.
So what you have here, you can even argue that it's a direct object if you want. The issue is
Right.
not that. The issue is how do these agents relate to one another in the sentence? And the ground of that is not all this other stuff. It's synergeo, which already has woven into it synergism. You have God
No, I
working
I
all
agree
things
with
together
that, but
for
now-
good with
but
those
now-
who love him.
but that's a separate clause. So now but you take reading A, right? You're a reading A guy, which means you take God.
I'm indeterminate, but yeah, sure. I'll go with reading it just for the sake of it.
Okay, so you already have hatheos as your subject and noun of the sentence for this particular clause, and the tois agaposin ton theon is from would not be the noun that sooner gaze. if you take the variant with hatheos, correct? Or no?
Either way, my reading is true. Because
Just
even if it's God,
because reasons.
no, I'm serious. Yes, because, and here's why. Because if God is the one specifically doing that, and I would argue that the Spirit as God is the one cooperating and working all things together, and then the question becomes, how does this work in harmony with this agent, this group of people? And the tois agaposi occurs throughout the Old and New Testament, in Exodus and Deuteronomy, to describe the corporate body of believers who are already loving God and often in St. Deuteronomy 5:10, keeping his commandments. These are already people that are engaged with him. This is a relationship of reciprocity. So you have God working with those who love him, or God working all things together with those who love him. So even if the A reading is perfectly consistent with my view, and so is the B reading. The B reading makes, I think, the argument for the Holy Spirit more obvious. But I think what you have here is
only if on the B reading you take all things as the accusative and not the subject, not the nominative.
right, because the verb requires an object to be performing the task, and that means Jewett translates it, or renders it, I should say, as it, where it cooperates, which I'm like, that doesn't help us. So, and that's why I have in there, Panta therefore functions as the subject, even though it's not articular. It doesn't have a definite article to mark it out. And Panta is also impersonal. All things, what on earth does that mean? You know, Panta doesn't really function like that in a lot of Paul's letters. It could, but Pritchett, I'll give you this. It could function like that here. I'm not going to say all these other instances mean this can't function like that here, but you got to give me a little of that too.
See, I want this alternative reading to be true, and I can get there contextually. I don't think, and this, I was discussing this with Dr. Joel Karitko. I was telling him I really want this alternative reading to be true, because I don't want God working with stuff. I want God working with us, right? That would be great. Unfortunately, as much as you can make a contextual argument,
God works all things together with us.
Okay, so that's the prepositional issue. With or for?
That's not the preposition. That's the issue of how do you translate the dative. Tois agapose.
I know, but you have to insert a preposition when you're translating dative.
Is it in them, by them, through them, to them, with them?
For them or with them?
For them is probably, I think, too paraphrastic. But
and you're wanting with instead of on their behalf, which most people take datives to be the beneficiaries, so they say for them, not with them.
It's a contextual argument, and most of the time they don't make it. You can establish grammatical rules all the time for various different things, but context will often tell you more about what the grammar is doing contextually.
Yeah, somebody's got a TV on.
Yes, I do, because I'm in a living room, so I'll mute myself. Sorry.
Okay, so I like I said, I want this to be true, and I can see it contextually, but I don't know. I think the grammar Nazis are going to get after anybody who takes a hard line on that translation.
Well, they can kiss my grits, because they're going to take a hard line about it anyway. Nah. Like, we all have to argue from the text. So, nah.
Okay.
Well, so just so I can wrap my mind around this, you have reading A and reading B. I'm looking at my CSB that I'm reading through the Bible in this year, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God. Which reading is that? Is that A or B?
B.
Okay.
And that is assuming that Panta is nominative and not accusative, making it the subject of the clause there. So all things is God's not even the subject. All things is.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's all things somehow doing something for those who love God.
Well, and that's why I think the contextual thing that you're talking about, I think you can get there contextually given verses 26 and 27, because there's very obviously like the Spirit is, having he's interceding on our behalf, and, God is searching the hearts, and he knows the mind of the Spirit and intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And then you get to verse 28. If you want to have this, like, I think I like the reading where you can have the Spirit in verse 28, because it gives a more steady flow, I think, rather than just like verse 27, stop, here's a new point. By the way, we know, because like if I'm understanding anything with any sort of competence, it starts with an and, verse 28. So it's almost like a continuing thought. So to me, that, like, I like that contextual argument for that. But
sure. And if you're going to talk to Thomas Schreiner, you can say, Thomas Schreiner, all those Old Testament passages, do you think the Spirit was part of God, the Godhead, in reference to God or not? And so you can push back there and say, did Trinitarianism not become true until the New Testament, or can that? So yes, theologically you could get there, that when it says that God searches the hearts in the Old Testament precedents, that could be, you could retcon the Spirit into that. We're both Testament type of Christians, so we can retcon if we want to. I don't have a problem with that theologically. You might quibble exegetically, but I can see where Thomas Schreiner might insist that that's the Father searching the hearts and not the Spirit, which makes it the Father who is working all things. But that seems to be almost anti-Trinitarianism. I mean, granted, each can do their own thing.
Schreiner is also subordinationist in some sense. So,
yeah, I mean, I'm not saying Kevin Giles is right that they're heretics, but I'm not saying that at this point. The eternal subordination of the Son belief.
Let me throw in just kind of
please
more of a simple-minded, because that's where I am. I'm really enjoying this conversation, because you're not even entertaining James White's view of the decretal determinism that he was trying to use verse 28 to support. And I love the fact that y'all are talking about these.
Sorry, I was going to be snarky. I apologize.
Okay. I love hearing y'all talk about it without even entertaining that this is about decretalism, i.e. determinism. And that's entertaining for me, because me with my one string over here always goes back to the argument that the Calvinist tries to use this verse to mean all things, meaning determinism. I mean, God determines everything that happens, is basically the way James White uses that in this debate with Tim Barber. And the fact that y'all are discussing this without even entertaining that even could possibly be what he's talking about is humorous to me, but also delightful. But let me just say this: if you follow the flow of this, he's talking about obviously those who are hurting, saints who are hurting, who are struggling, the groaning of the creation and the groaning of the individual. They're suffering, and then basically he's just flowing right from that, saying, and God works that suffering, that thing that's causing the suffering, and all the things that are causing your suffering and your pain, all those things God redeems. That's the way I'm reading this. He redeems it for good. He brings about good from whatever suffering you're going through. Saints of old who've gone through all of these horrible things, the trials in the desert, all the things that God's people who love him and are called according to his purpose have gone through, God works them all out. He redeems them for good. That's the way I've always read this text. That's the way I've always, not always, but that's the way I read this text since I've left Calvinism and understood it. And maybe, again, I'm being too simple-minded there, but that seems like the basic understanding of the meaning, regardless of some of the different arguments you can bring up about the different synergistic concepts within that. But that seems like the natural flow of it.
I could be wrong, but James White is at least somewhat favorable towards the NASB. I think he might have worked on the committee, translation committee. For
Yes,
a
he
time.
does use the NSB. Yes.
Okay, and I think he was on the translation, and so I know that he has to be, if he quotes it from the NASB, he has to be taking side A, or what are we talking, variant A, because he puts God as the subject. Now the problem with the NASB that our audience picked that out on a poll. The problem is Synergay does not mean causes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I thought
right.
that too.
It absolutely does not mean causes. It means work.
Should I read a footnote, Pritchett?
Please.
Oh, it's not causes, it's decrees. That God decrees, not cause.
Definitely. Now we're nowhere near the entire. Now you could do a lot of things with words. You can broaden their range and stretch that, but even that doesn't get you there.
So I'm going to read from Robert Jewett's commentary because I think it's helpful and actually captures, I think, the spirit of what we were all saying. So let's see. The saying of Issachar in a pre-Christian Aramaic papyrus, so nerd, reflects a similar confidence in the divine capacity to aid believers. Quote, the righteous among men, all who or all things that meet him are for his help. The use of the verb synergain works with, cooperates with, so that uses the infinitival form of the verb, brings Paul's formula close to the apocalyptic perspective of the Testament of the 12 patriarchs. But then he just moved down, and this is page 527 of his major commentary. But I have been it claims a divine human synergism in the midst of disadvantageous circumstances, because the Spirit works with those who love God. In the tangled discussion about the translation, appropriate parallels for verse 28, the soon that is the soon prefix, the with or co prefix of the verb sooner gain has tended to drop out of consideration. And then footnote, he says, Cranfield, my favorite Reformed commentator, explicitly repudiates the translation work together with in favor of the more bland translation assist, help on, profit, which is consistent with a Calvinist perspective hostile to synergism. I just wanted to make this end quote, but I wanted to make this point too. Whenever people go to this passage, the soon drops away, and that participatory or that cooperative or even that synergistic model goes away when it's literally in the sentence, and no amount of thrumming or screaming or looking down at people who use interlinears during debate Q&A will make that go away. So
Amen.
Just to make that point clear.
And this puts Dr. White in a peculiar predicament had he not begged off from this line of questioning with Tim Barber. Because if he takes side A, and I don't know how prepared Tim was for this in the debate, but then that means he's already forfeited. If he's taking A and says God causes, which is not a translation at all of Sooner Day, but if he's taking God as the subject, then therefore all things is off the table as the subject. It has to be the accusative, right? So you have two options here. You have option A, God works together with things for those who love him, or works together with those who love him, all things. So
Right.
our earlier conversation, it is dative. If you change the preposition from for those who love him to with those who love him,
Don't be smuggling as if you proved your point on that.
No, I'm just saying when you translate datives into English, you have to pick a preposition to translate. You have to supply that. And N.T. Wright's argument is for those who love him is the wrong preposition to insert there. With is the correct preposition. God works together with those who love him in all things to bring about the good. And so I wish White hadn't begged off the line of questioning, because I was curious as to where he would go with that. Is it for? Does he work all things for good for those who love God, or does he work all things with those? So God's working with all things with people who are therefore.
The verb tells us, Pritchett. The verb tells us. Like the verb, the cooperative verb really strongly implies, I won't say explicitly, implies that it would be with those who love him. And that with those who love them is commonly used throughout the Septuagint to describe those who love God. And
Yeah, I agree that synergeho means works together. The question is God simply working together with stuff, with things for people who love God, or is God working together with things with those who love God?
God works all things together with those who love him.
Yeah. And that gets us to the next issue with this text. Ben Witherington makes mention of this in his commentary when it comes to prophecy, purpose. The his is supplied in English, but not in the Greek. It's God works together with those who love him in all things for good.
Pritchett, you
Those
also have
called,
verse 22. We know that the
those
whole creation
called
has
according
has
to
been groaning.
purpose.
Okay.
Paul's Greek just says those called according to purpose. So I don't mind the translation his purpose, applying the his in Greek, because ultimately his purpose. But what is that purpose? That's the question. What is that purpose, his purpose, or the purpose, or just purpose? And the panta, all things, is that all things that happen in reality, or is that God works together all things related to bringing about the glorious freedom that he's about to explain? Those are two different questions. One would be what Leighton was talking about with respect to all things being this deterministic decree that whatsoever comes to pass, God is somehow working together all of these things like ingredients. Another reading would be God is working together with those who love him for the good in all the things that happen. But not all the things that happen, period, but all the things that are happen related to bringing about the good specifically for those who love him, which is a different thing than working together all things for good for those who love him, but encompassing things that are unrelated to those who love him, like a splash of water from a footprint in a pagan nation or something, I mean,
Right. Yeah, I think when you're talking contextually, it's talking about the suffering of saints. It's talking about the suffering of those who are his people. And so it's in that context, he's saying all the things that are causing the suffering, God's working all those things out for good. He's redeeming those things for the good of those who do love and follow him. That it doesn't have to be all that complicated if you understand it in that context, in my estimation.
That's where I was going to go as well, because not to get further ahead, but reading verse 38, right? For I am sure that neither death nor life, so the things present or things to come, height nor depth. And then when you go back up, when he talks about prayer, I think first of all, take into account that this is an epistle, and these are generally used to encourage the brethren or encourage the saints as well. So when he talks about for the Spirit, we don't know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit helps and intercedes and so on and so forth. So yes, we can apply it to us in modern time, how to prayer and so on and so forth for groanings. But what were they groaning for back then, or why were they groaning in first century? It was persecution, it was trials, it was things that they were suffering for. So contextually, the sufferings of this present time, he says it there. So the Spirit helping them in prayer with groanings, I think, is akin to their suffering, to their persecution. So when you keep reading, death, life, and so on and so forth, I think it's in context to that, when it's like all things work together and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how I,
which I think is a parallel to what we read in Ephesians 1:11, when he also uses the term all things.
Right.
The purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will, same kind of concept, because he's talking about those who love him, those who have been redeemed, those who have been predestined for life, destined beforehand for life.
And the all things there in Ephesians 1 are all the things that are enumerated in that exordium, not necessarily all things that if some guy in Minnesota spits on the sidewalk, that somehow that is included in this all-encompassing degree.
No rogue molecule. Yeah,
right.
Kind of
Rise to the
concept.
fabric of time and space continuum and all of that stuff that we hear. See, from the decretalists or determinists or whatever. See, that's what I'm, I am sympathetic to when Calvinists say all doesn't always mean all, because I don't even think that all things, that Paul was sitting here thinking that if some guy in Minnesota in the 1980s spit on a sidewalk and never gives his life to Christ, and because it's Minnesota. No, I'm just kidding. But you know what I'm saying? Like somebody just ran it, like God is working even in that. I don't think that that's what Paul's thinking here, which means I don't think that this is either this or Ephesians 1:11 is some sort of all things being what they've smuggled into the Westminster Confession, all things whatsoever come to pass. That God is taking the time to work every random spit of the sidewalk into coming out for something good for those who love him, which is why it blows my mind that they appeal to these passages for some sort of all-encompassing decree when Paul's certainly not even talking about that. Ephesians 1, and of course in this debate, Dr. White conflated Romans 8:28 with Ephesians 1. We pointed that out when we did the review. But in both of these passages, there are specific things going on with those who are seeking the Spirit that are anticipating the redemption of their bodies, this adoption, becoming co-heirs, the creation itself being, waiting for release. It just doesn't seem like all the things is the just random things you could think of. I know that when Chris Fisher, our good friend Chris Fisher, reviewed our debate that you and I had, Leighton, with he used very, very disgusting type of metaphors when he said all things. But so I don't want to get graphic and talk about diarrhea splatter like he was doing. But but just random things. Not necessarily what Paul has in mind. Ephesians 1's more clear, the things enumerated about the things that God had done.
Most often this verse is used when talking about theodicy, the problem of evil.
Yeah.
This is often brought up. And interestingly, John MacArthur, who's known to be obviously Calvinistic, he wrote in his commentary this. He says, but God's role regarding evil is never as its author. He simply permits evil agents to work and then overrules evil for his own wise and holy ends. Ultimately, he is able to make all things, including all the fruits of all evil of all time, work together for a greater good. And then he cites Romans 8:28. And again, I don't necessarily think that that's what Paul was trying to communicate in that context, because it seems to be talking specifically about the sufferings of the saints and working those sufferings out for their good and redeeming those sufferings for their good. That's what it seems to be talking about. But what people often do, theologians using systematic theology, they'll grab a verse out of its context and say, see, this is a good verse on theodicy. God's working all evil events for his ultimate good. And it may be argued that God can redeem all evil events for his ultimate good in some sense without necessarily affirming decretalism/determinism. But that's the whole point when you're talking about interpretation and not using eisegesis, reading your theology into a verse, but exegesis. What is Paul meaning? What is he talking about in this context? And you have to limit that, in my estimation, it seems you have to limit that to the suffering of the saints, because that's the context of the verse.
Yeah. I've got my MacArthur here. My dad's commentary, that's why I'll never let it go, even though I'm not a fan. But
he's got some good stuff. For sure.
But to his credit, anything evil that occurs that can be worked to good for those who love God, I can say that that's fair use.
Yeah.
But as we talked about in the debate review, Leighton, I'm dubious to think that God is trying to work evil things that happen among people who will never love him. One non-believer doing evil to another non-believer. Unless there's no way that works together for some other third-party believer, I don't know that God's necessarily even interested in working that out for good for believers necessarily, at least not directly. I mean, maybe indirectly.
Or at least this verse doesn't prove it. That for
right,
sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that we're talking about it in the specific context in which Paul is saying this, because honestly, when I read through Romans 8, what you have is we like, you can go back to our previous videos where we talked about, leading up to this point, but then what you have is the ministry of the Holy Spirit up until verse 17, when he says, and if children, also heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. And that's kind of like a transition there. For then you get into verse 18, where he says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is going to be revealed. So verse 17 mentions being glorified with him. And then I think everything Paul is saying basically is in the context of eschatological glorification in Christ, the being conformed to his image, which we're about to talk about in verses 29 through 30. So whenever I read verse, we started with verse 26 going into 27, and then that, I think that transitions nicely into verse 28 in the same context of glorification that Paul is building up to, and I think it reaches its climax in verse 30.
And to Troy's Posson for Joel there saying that no one, especially Nick, can read Greek on this panel. The comment section was talking about 37, and all these things seems to be a little bit more specific anyway. And so let this be to all the Calvinists watching. Here you have 5 non-Calvinists saying all doesn't always mean all. So clip it out. Tell the world that not even.
And it's funny to me whenever some Calvinists make that argument, because I guess there are some Arminians and non-Calvinists who do try to say that all means all the time. But I don't know of any good exegete that's of the Arminian persuasion, the Wesleyan persuasion, provisionist persuasion that argues that all always means all, in a decretal / determinative sense of every single molecule. I don't know of any of us who make that argument.
I'm glad you qualified that with good exegetes, because Norman Geisler
I was just about to bring up Geisler.
Yeah, Geisler says all always means all, and that's all means. And I'm like, he does say that, and he's not a Calvinist, but he's also not a good exegete. So
no.
So I'm glad you qualified that. And Dr. Kritko says, none of you, I already quoted that. He said he wants Nick to prove it.
Nick doesn't seem interested in proving
I want
it.
I want Dr. Joel to prove it. When he comes up, when he finally makes it, he can always show up in the comments. He never shows up on the program. So he needs to prove your credentials, Dr. Joel. No,
don't say that to an Oxford man. They
I know he's smarter than every one of us by lots. That's obvious. All right, so predestination. We've kind of beat this to death here. This working together. Golden chain of overinterpretation. I love Nick Quint for making these PowerPoints. The golden chain of eisegesis. The golden chain of you made that up.
I'll go on the record saying I think it's a great chain. It's a chain unbroken for those who have loved God in the past, because look at the chain. Look at the chain of all the things that God did for those who've loved him over the centuries. Because that's what prognosko in my interpretation is referring to, those formerly known, those known before. And so this is the reason I think, and my argument is the reason he switches in verse 29 to past tense verbs is because he's talking about those in the past. And so how do you prove that God has brought about good for the suffering of his people than by looking at those in the past who have suffered?
Dr. Joel is going to scream at you, Dr. Flowers, about it's technically aorist that we render in English in the simple past tense, but okay.
Yeah, well, I'm standing on the shoulders of other exegetes that make this argument.
Me too. That's every Christian is standing on the shoulders of other Christians. But this predestically justi glorified. Nick, well done. I like it. You should have added 4, but I know that we're already discussing.
Just something to know. Notice too, in verse 20 begins with, for those he foreknew, he also predestined, which already tells us that predestination is not equivalent to foreknowledge. So we can all go home now.
Well, there are those who will say that foreknew here is really better rendered as foreordination.
And they
And how
argue
that
like
and
I
how is
did
that
trying
different
to
than
convince you,
predestination?
So
I don't know. I'm just telling you that there are Calvinists who do that.
So
Not all
for those God foreordains, i.e., predestines, he predestines.
Right.
So he's
Now,
just redundantly repeating the same meaning.
yeah, that's why I wanted to say not all Calvinists do that.
see that just makes Paul a bad writer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, foreknew, people will talk about this gnosko being an intimate, not merely prescient knowledge or propositional knowledge, but an intimate knowledge. Those whom he foreknew here is more than just knowing something about a person, but actually knowing them in a more intimate, personal way. Intimate, personal. Not from Arkansas. Give me a break. Intimate, personal. We don't get intimate with people. Intimate, personal way. This is deeper than just, facts about somebody. So when the Arminian says, well, God knew facts about people who would accept him, through faith, that's who he predestined. Or, yes, Adrian Rogers said this. God looked down the corridors of time. Yes, Adrian Rogers did say that in a sermon. You can find it.
No, he was wrong.
Yeah, he was wrong. So when Arminians say no Arminian says this, well, Adrian Rogers did say that, but
Adrian Rogers probably wouldn't be considered an Arminian. So
true, he's a Southern Baptist.
Well, if I were to steelman some Arminians, because that is a very common Calvinist objection to the foreknowledge being like the knowing the future beforehand, is they'll say God foresees people, not actions. Like it's who does he foreknow, not what does he foreknow about these people. But if I were to steelman some Arminians, Leroy four lines, to paraphrase him, it's God foreknows those who would believe, and that's where the chain goes from there. It's not foreknew that they would have faith, but he foreknew them as believers. So,
well, even I'll tell you what. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was just simply going to say, what helped me, I think this was like last month actually, is the Potter's Promise. So hashtag Mr. LF for that. And what's your video? Romans 11:2. Did God cast away those people who we foreknew? That just listening to that and reading that part, I've literally scrambled through your book and finding that helped, because reading through N.T. Wright's commentary, like Wright mentions, I think from chapter 2, and then working his way up chapter 9. I think chapter 2 he mentions there is a Jew, and then chapter 9 there is an Israel and an Israel. So right the way through he's carrying this whole point of Jews, Israel and the Gentiles and so on and so forth. And when I read your commentary, that kind of hit the nail on my head for me with this passage. Reading Romans 11:2, has God cast away his people whom we foreknew? And I think even in later on in chapter 11, where he mentions, the gifts and callings are of God around repentance regarding the Israel that's been broken up. So it just made sense reading that into this in regards to the foreknowing would be the Israel or God's people who we foreknew back then in the past. And I think you kind of passed that out as you kind of read prior and then reading back to this passage.
That's where Dr. Flowers and I land, which is why as much as I like Forloin's explanation, and that would probably be my second most plausible interpretation.
I agree.
The first most plausible is what Junior just hit on, and I think that was the question behind Edwin P. Whipple's. Right. Who are those? And for those, and who are those? And that's why I don't have a problem going along with our Calvinist friends that, I'm all on board with this intimate knowing.
Right.
Great.
That works. That works great for our view. Yep.
Yeah, because who are those that God
Moses was intimately known. Isaiah was intimately known. Yeah. They were called according to the purpose. Look at how God worked out the sufferings they went through for his good and his purpose. What an awesome way to refer back to those formerly known and look at their sufferings and look at how God redeemed their sufferings for his good. He brought about the redemption of humanity through those very people's sufferings. And what better case could Paul be making than to reflect back on those formerly known?
Exactly, because this, and this is a point I've made. What comes before verse 29 is 28, where he talks about, you know, whichever A or B translation you take, and then verse 29, for those whom he foreknew. So it's continuing the thought. How do we know that God works these things out?
Right.
And it makes the most sense contextually. We have examples to look back at.
Yeah.
Right.
And it removes, if you think about it, it removes all the esoteric baggage of this, you know, looking through the corridors of time thing, or this determination of every thought, molecule, and action, and all the different weird, you know, debates that people have created since the 16th century. It just removes all of that, and it makes it so simple. It really does. And especially the fact that Paul uses the exact same term, like you said, in chapter 11, verse 2, in reference to the formerly known Israelites of old.
Exactly. We know now. I like how Ben Witherington translates it in his commentary. He says, or he puts, we know, or we ought to know. Well, how do we ought to know? Well, we ought to know based on what God has done in the past, which is something that Paul has been talking about at least since chapter 4. He goes all the way back to creation in chapter 1, talking about the decline of civilization, as Nick likes to point out. But chapter 4, you have Abraham. You have David. I mean, how do we know? Well, look what God has done in the past. So those he foreknew, he what? He also predestined them.
Well, and this is where I think that the Calvinist interpretations have always kind of been lacking. Like Sean Wright in his book, speaking of the Golden Chain, says, Paul says the bedrock of Christian assurance goes all the way back to eternity, where God chose to place his love on his people. That's the meaning of foreknowledge in his view. But I think what that gives you is basically you got Romans 8:28, and then Paul leads into verse 29 being like, we know this because of this new revelation that I'm going to give to you to let you know how the Ordo Salutis works. And that doesn't flow at all to me. No, that doesn't work.
And more importantly, Ephesians, you might, and I seriously say no, you might be able to get there, assuming that pro katabalis cosmou means something about eternity, which was another conversation of getting into time and before time or logically prior to time or whatever. Whatever you think before the foundation of the world means, which I'm not certain we have a definitive answer to that. Paul knows how to write the phrase. It's not in Romans 8 and Ephesians 1. However you take that, which we can haggle over, did he choose individuals to be in Christ, which is not what it says. However you want to hash out Ephesians 1, Paul knows how to say something like that that may give you help there. It's not here in Romans 8:29. There's nothing about logically prior to the temporal cosmos. Right. Eternity past here.
Well, and so I've held to this, which you and Leighton and we're all talking about. I've held to this view for quite a while, but before I think this is the Ben Witherington interpretation. I flirted with that for a little bit. I think it's where, like, because verse 28 says all things work together, that when you go into verse 29, you're kind of like looking at the end backwards and saying, like, we were able to see this, right?
Yeah. For clarity, jumping back to verse 18, for
that's
the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to be revealed in the future. And this, Romans 8:29 and 30, is a looking back from the perspective of that future. That's been Witherington's interpretation.
Right. And
I give him number 3. His reading is number 3rd most likely. I give the Old Testament saints the most likely. I give the traditional Armenian God foreknew the people who would believe the forloins thing. I give that number 2. I give Witherington's number 3, which is kind of building on forloins view, but adds this from the future looking back perspective. The reason why I don't buy that.
That's more of a corporate view as well, if I'm not mistaken. That's kind of a corporate perspective as well. Witherington view.
But the reason why I don't find Witherington as even convincing as the standard Four Loins Arminian perspective is he's assuming something about glorified that I don't assume.
Right.
He's assuming that, like a lot of exegetes get this wrong, that glorified is something about the body in the new heavens and new earth, looking
Right.
back from that. Whereas there's nothing about being glorified here that has to do with the bodies. Romans 8 does talk about the redemption of our bodies, but it doesn't say anything about the glorification of our bodies. This is talking about foreknowing people, predestining those people, calling those people, justifying those people, and glorifying their bodies. No, glorifying them. Honorific language. He is highly esteeming, highly honoring them. He's glorying them.
Well, and that
Them, not their bodies, them.
it goes with Colossians 3:4, where he says, when Christ returns, you too will be revealed in glory with him. And it doesn't say that, like revealed in glory, right? So it kind of implies that there's a condition that is being given, and then it's revealed in the end times, but Christ is also revealed at that same time. So it doesn't have to be something that is like what you're saying, like the redemption of the body.
Right. Go back to
Well, and if it is in reference to the redemption of the body, then it even supports the reading that we hold to even more so, because people like Isaiah and Moses and all the saints of the past have been glorified in that sense that they have their bodies have passed on and they are present. You could argue they are currently present with the Father.
Well, but they don't have their glorified. They don't have their imperishable.
Well, that could be an argument. That could be an argument.
Per 1 Corinthians 15, they're imperishable bodies. They don't have those, the heavenly bodies. But this is talking about, in verse 21, that the creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption, into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. The glory of the children, the high honor, the high glory. That doxa, that's honorific language in the ancient Mediterranean world that has a meaning. Now, you skip to verse 23. He does talk about adoption as the redemption of our bodies, but that's a part of the glory, but that's not the glory that Paul's hammering on about here. He's talking, this is honor language. He's talking about the glorification of these people. And yeah, so I don't see how you get the Ben Witherington view from this, which should tell you that if we think, we'll call it the Dr. Flowers view. This is about, we ought to know because God has already done this with Old Testament saints like Abraham and David. We'll call that the Flowers view. And then you have the Four Loins view, which is the standard Arminian view. Then you have the modified Arminian view of Witherington. We put that at number 3, most likely. I would put that this is a passage about a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, talking about Han Solo and Chewbacca as more likely than the Calvinist reading that those who God foreordained, he predestined prior to the creation of a temporal cosmos. That is like the least likely interpretation of all of this. And you can see that we have at least one that I made up. We have the Calvinist interpretation, and we have 3 non-Calvinist interpretations that we can debate without even considering Calvinism, and that's important to note.
No, go ahead, Junior.
I was just going to say, and this even goes back to what you mentioned as well. Look how Paul uses creation as that example of the believers, right? So verse 18, for I consider that the sufferings present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory. And then he uses creation as the example. Creation also, so he says, verse 20, for the creation was subject to bondage, right? Not willingly, but that he calls it subject to the same, that the creation itself will be set free. And then he mentions in verse 22, for we know that the whole creation. So again, it's in reference to something that we can look back and see, this is an example of. So creation is that example. It's been, this has happened to it, and then so on and so forth. So, and then that word again, I think you mentioned, for we know that the whole creation is groaning and waiting. So he's using that as an example for verse 18, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory. Using creation as that example for something that we know. And then he goes down, obviously the passage at hand, where is it? And we know, and we know that all things work together for good and so on and so forth. So again, it's this looking backwards because we have this example, right? So the looking backwards would be, well, what is the example? If Paul is using creation as an example looking backwards, and then he's going to verse 28 saying, for we know. So what is the example going backwards? It's people. Who is the people in the example?
I would agree with you, Junior, but I think that you're actually making a very good argument for Witherington's view, because verse 18 follows verse 17 about, if children, heirs of God, and fellow or co-heirs with Christ, indeed, if we suffer for him, that we may also be glorified with him. That is kind of future looking, though. So the present sufferings, the glory that is to be revealed, could also be future looking. So I think that actually gives, what you just said, gives credence to the Witherington view more so than it does the Flowers view.
Well, and for those, I was reading some of the, sorry, for those in the comments that were kind of confused about what we're arguing for, the view we're arguing for, I will admit that if you've not thought through these things before, if you've not heard our view, it can kind of sound like it's out there, like, oh, I've always thought of this as a, foresight view or a predetermination kind of concept, and it may be hard to follow. And so this quote from my commentary from Tim Warner may help, because he kind of gives you an overview of this passage from his perspective. Let me read it. It says, Paul was not referring to some prior knowledge in the mind of God before creation, nor was he speaking about predetermining their fate. He was referring to those whom God knew personally and intimately, men like Abraham and David, for example. The term foreknew does not mean to have knowledge of someone before they were conceived. The verb simply is the word for know, and it's an intimate sense, which a presupposition before prefix to it is having an intimate relationship with someone in the past. Literally, we could render Romans 8:29 as follows: for those God formerly knew, I need my glasses on here. For those God formerly knew, he previously determined them to conform them into the image of his Son. The individual saints of old with whom God had personal relationship were predestined by him to be conformed in the image of Christ. That is, God predetermined to bring their salvation to completion by the sacrifice of Christ on their behalf. And again, and I cite some other scholars who hold to the same view, but I just want to make sure people are following the kind of the course of Paul's thought through this process. The reason I think he begins to shift to the past tense, even though I do recognize that you can talk about somebody glorified in the Greek language as if it's an already not yet kind of concept. It's a very rare usage, however. And therefore, I think the more simple concept is to say that the reason he shifts to the past tense is because he's talking about those intimately known in the past.
And to put a button on what Junior was saying, what he was saying sounded like you could put it more towards the Witherington column, except for the fact that this passage shifts
right
in 23 and 24, and maybe you were thinking this, where it talks about what's going on with us. And this is a passage about insurance, about our hope. And what do we bank that hope on while we're groaning, the Spirit's groaning, creation's groaning, we're suffering, all of this? What do we base that hope on? That hope would be on the people of the past, that we could, because of what God has done in the past. So that I think 22 through 24 swings it away from the Witherington thing to the Flowers thing.
It also makes a lot of sense just if you're using the whole counsel of God, because you can go read it in Psalm 77, but throughout the Old Testament all the time, when they need hope for deliverance, what do? They look backwards. And in Psalm 77 particularly, and a lot of other places, they look back to the Exodus. God was faithful here, so we know he will be faithful in the future. So Paul is just kind of, in my opinion, doing the same thing. We have hope for the future because we look back at what God has previously done.
Yeah.
And I was going to say as well, and that's brilliant, Derek, as well, because that's what I got from it. I was going to say, could you as well, Mr. Flowers, verse 29, because this was something that I picked up as well that you mentioned. It was the last part that done it for me, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brethren.
Yes.
So could you, if I don't know if you remember how you exegeted that part in verse 29.
Well, it's not a cut and dry thing like it proves my case. It's just one of those things that supports, in my opinion, my case, so that he might be, meaning like that. In other words, when David was alive, Christ hasn't come yet, and he hasn't become the firstborn of all creation. It's that he might become the firstborn of all creation through David, through working through those who are called according to his purpose. And he's bringing about good even through David's life and all of the life of those in the lineage of Christ and all those formerly known, to bring about someone who might become the firstborn of all creation, Christ. Well, when Paul's talking about here, Christ has already been born and has already died and been resurrected. So to speak of him as that he might become seems to be more supportive of our view of those formerly known, because if he's talking in the past tense about those formerly known, then Christ is still yet to become the firstborn of all creation. It doesn't prove my case. It doesn't, because I can understand that you can use that kind of grammar to speak of something that might be that already is, and that's why you can always have the already not yet kind of concepts. But that's not the natural reading. It's not the most obvious reading. It is a more rare usage within Greek, and therefore it should be secondary to the simpler. Usually, the most simple and easy to understand way is the correct way. And if our way is the most easy and understandable and doesn't have all this esoteric baggage that causes so much controversy and paints God in a bad light, then why not go with the view that we're presenting here?
Yeah,
it's more simple.
I'm going to make a stronger point than you. I was going to save this for when we get into Romans 9, because Prothesin, this idea of purpose comes back up in Romans 9:11, right? Mm-hmm. Firstborn also means preeminent. This is why I think it proves, right? Firstborn means preeminent one, right? Mm-hmm. It is a position of preeminence in the ancient Mediterranean world. And the reason why it actually does prove your point is because if you notice, and you can actually, it's not like 100% solid, because I think it was 3, maybe 4 times. It's been a while since I've read my Kings and Chronicles, but overwhelmingly, it was not the firstborn that inherited the crown. It was the secondborn, all the way, and that's just the line of Kings. But you go back to Isaac and Jacob. Is it the firstborn? No, it's the secondborn. Who is the preeminent one? Jesus. So all of those, including the Old Testament saints that we ought to know, because God also did this with them, is Jesus is the firstborn. And that's why the promise of Jesus came through overwhelmingly second or even third or fourth in some cases, and only in a very, very, very select few. So it's not perfect, but I mean, just to Paul's point, talking about Isaac and Jacob anyway, in the very next chapter, is the secondborn is the one through whom the promise of the preeminent one, Jesus, to whom all are conformed to his likeness, or fashioned into the icon. That's the secondborn. So I think it does actually prove your reading, but again, other people may differ on that.
Well, and I kind of wanted to address something, because Leighton's knocked on it a couple times now, is like, for instance, Peterson and Williams in Why I'm Not an Arminian, they said these actions are so certain that the apostle expresses them in the past tense. And then Sean Wright in 40 Questions for Calvinists, he says it is so certain that the Lord can speak of it in the past tense. Now, if you go with the interpretation that we're talking about, the past tense makes perfect sense because it happened in the past. And I guess it's possible that in the Greek, you could, like the whole thing about it's so certain that it's in the past tense. I guess that's possible. I can't speak to that, but it just really
is a rare reading. It is a rare reading in Greek that it can be used that way. So we can grant that.
It'd be really convenient.
And the aorist tense is really, we render it simple past tense for the sake of English readability. But that's a readability more than meaning kind of thing. Because what the aorist, and Joel, if you're out there, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the point of it is more of the kind of thing that's taking place more so than the when of the thing. So simple past tense is just an easy way to say, he did this kind of thing, right? Because it's already happened. That's why it's in the past tense. But the emphasis is really on what kind of thing. And so with the aorist here, all these aorist tenses that we have with for no, predestined, called, justified, whatever. What are these things, right? We've talked about foreknew. Maybe we should address the thumb. What is going on with predestined, right? We all think, I'm sure, I don't know what Nick thinks about this, but I know it seemed like Junior, before he had to hop off, he was on board with the flower. We'll call it the flowers reading. That God foreknew those in the past, which is why it can be considered as certain for Paul's audience and for us, the subsequent audience. Why do we know? Because God has already done it, and He will continue to do it through His past actions with the Old Testament saints. Derek, are you on board with that, or are you still 2 or 3 or?
No. I'm right there with you. Like I said, that's something that I wanted like years ago. That's what I was seeing, but I got hung up on the glorification thing.
Right. Now, as far as being conformed to the image of His Son, or fashioned to the icon of His Son, which is a better translation, I think, also gets people out of the familiarity, so they think, wait a minute, fashioned into the icon. Wait a minute, what's going on there? But I mean, the icon is, Paul uses that word. But the predestined, as with Ephesians 1, 4 and 5 and so forth, there's always a telos, a predestined to something. That, yes, it's about people, but people are predestined to an end. And here it is to be conformed to the image of His Son.
It's the same as in Ephesians 1, to be made holy and blameless. He's predestined us to be made holy and blameless, which is exactly the same as being conformed to the image of Christ, because He's the only holy and blameless one. And so both times the word predestination is used.
Yeah, in Ephesians 1, it's in love He predestined. So,
well, that's to the redemption that he goes on to say that. But the verse 4 is that he predestined us to be made holy and blameless, which is exactly the same as being predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ. And so who is predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ? Who is predestined to be made holy and blameless? Believers are. Just like believers of old.
In Him, before the foundation of the world, whatever that means, to be that we would be holy and blameless before Him in love. Anyway.
Oh yeah, well, some people put the new sentence in love. He predestined
period,
us,
and then in love He predestined us unto the adoption as sons and daughters.
Yeah, there's a debate about whether in love is before.
There's no debate. It's one huge run-on sentence, which I have students say when I pick on their grammar. They're like, "Well, I mean, Ephesians 1:3 through 14, or sometimes even 16, is one huge sentence. So if Paul, inspired by the Spirit, can write run-on sentences, why can't I?" But it's really, but yeah, I mean, we put periods and stuff.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's question. One huge sentence. So, where do you go with that? But anyway, that's for another.
Hey, that's inerrant. If it's inerrant, that's not an error.
Yeah,
I mean, right?
One huge, long run-on sentence.
It's not an error. There you go. All those grammaticians that try to come down on us, we'll just throw an errancy at them as they start.
Because even though Paul did not have much use for Asiatic rhetoric when he was writing 1 Corinthians, and all these people with all of their flowery language, when he writes to Asia Minor, he switches styles, which confused all the liberals. But Paul knows what he's doing. It's like, that's not the same writing style. No, because Paul adapts to his audience, and he uses this flowery, over-the-top, ornamental language. It's Asiatic rhetoric instead of Atticized rhetoric that he's using here in Romans. So, of course, it's all flowery and long and superfluous and all of that. That's why he sounds a little bit different in Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. But that's, anyway. Predestined is to something. Predestined is not. Okay, and about predestined, it's not a proorzo. It's not like a big word that you find all over ancient literature, but it's worth noting that Plutarch, writing in Koine Greek and Morelia, talks about how normal people predestined, that word, really they schedule or they provide or they furnish times to have conversations of free inquiry. So predestined here and foreknow here are not actually these big super duper religious words that we can overread, because Plutarch, contemporary of Paul, writing in Koine Greek, can use it in common language, talking about folks scheduling something, providing something, furnishing something to have a conversation about open inquiries, open-ended conversation.
Nowadays, we just have so much metaphysical baggage we attach to that.
Right. Yes. I mean, what is it? Botner or whoever writes a whole book about predestination.
That's
it's worth mentioning that predestined, it's always a verb. It's not a noun implying a theological construct. It's always a verb in the Bible, and the 6 times it's used. 4 of those times occur in 2 chapters. But anyway, Ephesians 1 and Romans 8 has 4 of the 6 occurrences. And in Romans 8, they happen within one verse of each other in 28 and 29.
And you always have to ask, who is being predestined to what?
Right.
Answering that simple question removes any doubt that we're talking about whether it's this deterministic, decreative stuff, because it's about a particular people, believers, being determined beforehand to become like Jesus, to become holy and blameless. That's all it's talking about. It's not talking about God in this pre-existent time before time began, choosing to ultimately create some people for destruction and other people for salvation, because that's the way ultimately you have to interpret Ephesians 1 and Romans 8 if you're going to take that esoteric baggage. And again, there's so much that flies in the face of that interpretation that there's no reason to adopt it. There's no reason to go there, given all the other passages of Scripture that seem to fly in the face of that reading. And of course, I know that Calvinists may not see it that way. I certainly didn't when I was holding to Calvinism. But coming back and just backing away from it and taking a simpler reading, when you take out Romans 8 and 9 and you take out Ephesians 1 and you understand them from that perspective, Calvinism is left with absolutely no apologetic, no defense for their perspective, because they're almost 95% based upon those 2 chapters of Scripture from Paul. And that's why I think this is so significant when we're talking about our debate, at least with regard to predestination among Calvinists and non-Calvinists.
And it goes with what you said. Who is predestined for what? Here you have predestined to be conformed to the image of his son in Ephesians 1. You have holy and blameless predestined to become sons, or to be adopted as sons, right? And whenever you take the Calvinist view, you kind of have to equate those to salvation. Like Peterson and Williams once again say, conformity to Christ is one way of speaking about salvation. I'm like, well, that's kind of a cop-out to just gloss over the specifics of what we're being predestined for and just say, oh, that just means salvation.
Well, I don't even mind so much, Derek, if you say you're predestined to salvation. Who's predestined to salvation? Believers are predestined to So it's really, for the Calvinist, it's really predestined to become believers so as to be saved.
Exactly.
They're having to pack all of that into the word. And so instead of predestining believers to become holy and blameless, no, we're predestining individuals chosen before the foundation of the world to become believers so as to be made holy and blameless. That has to all be packed into those 2 verses. And it's just, it has to rely upon eisegesis. There's nothing there exegetical.
And what's unfortunate about that is this complete dismissal of actually unpacking what it actually means to be fashioned into the icon of Christ or conformed to the image of Christ. What is this? It's this fashioning process. What is happening with that? Why is that predestined? Well, go back to Romans chapter 5.
Yes.
Go back to Romans chapter 1. Paul echoes the creation story all throughout. And if you want to contrast the type and the prototype of Adam and the type of Christ, the importance of and here in chapter 8 about being co-heirs and ruling in the age to come. It is so that we can get back to the Edenic garden project of being wise, sinless stewards of God's creation, right? And co-heirs, co-rulers, co-kings, whatever with Christ, We have to become like Christ so that that eschatological realization can take place and creation set free. And if you truncate that to think, well, he predestined you to become a Christian, you miss the entire point of being a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
For all eternity, be a Christian. What does it mean to be a Christian for all eternity? Not now that you went from not believing to believing something or in a person. It's what does that mean to be shaped like Christ? And I'm not just talking about sanctification in this life. The context of Romans 8 is so much bigger that we have to stop worrying about what a verb. It's all this. If you're a provisionist, you want to bug Arminians and Calvinists. Whenever they say, both of them will say this, predestination is in the Bible. Say, no, it didn't. There's a verb in the Bible about predestined, or fashion, or scheduling, or furnishing, or marking out a horizon, marking out a boundary, drawing a boundary beforehand. What do you mean predestination?
Which kind of makes you really think about Bettner's book, The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination.
Yeah, throw it out. Predestined is a verb. It just means to mark out beforehand towards a specific thing, right? So it's predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. The predestined end is to, I predestine things all day long. I predestined Leighton's dissertation schedule on his behalf. I don't need to deterministically cause him to believe anything. If he wants a paycheck, he does it. I predestine people all day long. I foreknow people all day long. These are not,
and that's what's interesting. Like for the Jeremiah 18 that we'll get into when we get into Romans 9 stuff with the clay pot analogy, when he talks about, I have destined for you. In other words, the molder, the potter is shaping Israel for a particular end. I mean, he is destining beforehand what he wants them to be. But because they become marred in his hands due to their own disobedience, not his mistake, their mistake, he can choose to remold and remake them in for an ignoble purpose. In other words, for another purpose than the one he destined beforehand. So this concept and idea of God's predestination being this decreative, pre-existent, script that God's decided, fated everything that you're going to decide and all that's going to happen to you, does not match the narrative of how Scripture works in any narrative, especially when it's talking about the potter clay analogies and those kinds of things throughout Scripture. And when you understand that, you begin to read Paul from that perspective. You understand he's talking about Israel. He's talking about reshaping and remolding a nation that has become marred in his hands. And he has every right as the sovereign, the potter, to reshape and remold and use that nation as he sees fit. And if they relent of the evil they're doing, then he has every right to reverse his order of calamity upon them and bring them blessing because of their being forgiven. And so that's just the plain reading of the text when you look at the whole of text and not just particular proof text.
Yeah, there's nothing in this passage that says in eternity's past, God picked specific individuals to go from being non-Christians into Christians, to convert from non-Christianity to Christianity. That's not even what predestined is about, much less predestination. If you make it a noun with the theological baggage you want to, predestined is just a verb, and it's not a noun implying a theological concept, particular to Christianity. God predestined, he pre-marked out a end goal or an end purpose for his people. And specifically in 29, he's talking about those he foreknew in the past prior to the time that Paul is writing to the present audience in Rome. He also did that thing to them that he's going to be doing to us with all this stuff that we're hoping for.
Right. And sometimes you'll hear that objection where it's, so this doesn't even apply to us at all, because you're talking about the people of the past. And we're going, no. That's exactly, that's the whole point is that just in the same way that God did this for David or Moses or Isaiah or all the saints of old, that God called according to his purpose, loved them according to his purpose, he destined beforehand for them to become like Jesus so that Jesus would become the firstborn among many brothers. Again, that's what we were talking about with Junior earlier, that it's not, has already become, that he would become the firstborn of many brothers and sisters. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these he called, he also justified. And so speaking in the past tense, this is what he did for David. He called him, he justified him, and he glorified him, all in the past tense, because he's speaking about people in the past. Therefore, we can rest assured that's exactly what he's doing with us and what he will do for us in our sufferings. Because David suffered, all these people of the past, they suffered, and look what God did for them. So we can know he will do it for us. So whenever you hear that objection, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with us anymore because he's talking about the people of the past. Baloney, and to use some Greek word for you. Baloney.
Yeah.
It's not at all true.
Yeah, and about this, Colossians 1:18, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Firstborn of what? Colossians 1:18, firstborn, the preeminent one. Firstborn
overall
from the
creation.
dead.
Mm-hmm.
This is resurrection language here.
Mm-hmm.
So he predestined them to be conformed to the image of Christ, so that he would be the firstborn, that image of Jesus. Jesus is the firstborn. We're all the secondborn. And you notice that the promise of Jesus comes through secondborn patriarchs and all of that. They're all a part of the same thing that we're a part of, is what this is probably not quite as a friendly reading to dispensationalists as it is to covenantal theology folks. But what he's saying is those people in the past, the reason why we know this is because God has done this for people in the past, that they are also this chain from the Old Testament saints that Leighton read from that commentary. They're also a part of this plan. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also glorified. And I know that some people, if you read the theological commentators, not necessarily the exegetes, the theological commentators will insert here to be the inward
effectual call.
Effectual call as opposed to the general call.
I think Paul is using it as more of a named, because he named.
Yeah, same language as Romans 9 again. In Isaac your seed shall be designated, named, called as in named.
Brian Abashano says Romans 8:30 is best understood as meaning, and those whom he predestined, he also named as his own, and those whom he named as his own, he also justified.
Right.
Yes,
called here is not summoning, and William Klein talks about the Klein has a journal article about the language there, and how Paul uses it in kind of a technical sense. And I think even in Dr. White's debate with Dr. Michael Brown, Dr. Brown pointed this out, that it's identical Greek in Romans 9:7 with this here about, through Isaac your descendants shall be named, and the NASB translates it named there, and in Romans 8 this is absolutely named. Or if you don't like the word named, like called, like I call you Derek, I call you Leighton, those are your names. You don't like named for called here, you could just designate it. Because when God designates you a thing, you are that thing, right? So named or designate would be another way that I would say it. Called is fine if you're thinking called as in I call you by something. But what people think here is first they think called means call aloud for somebody to summon them. And then if you're a Calvinist,
like the word invite.
Yeah, you split that. If you're a Calvinist, to mean not just summon, but now this call aloud summoning is actually an inward, quiet, effectual, inside of you summoning, which is not even, I don't know.
Well, so what you got, and we've already touched on it. There's nothing in here that says that this happened before the foundation of the world, because I've read before the stream. I read, Sean Wright's 40 Questions About Calvinism. I read what Dr. White had to say about it in The Potter's Freedom, and I also read it in what was the other one? Why I'm Not an Arminian. All three of them, going over this, use this passage as a proof text for unconditional election, which is a pre-creation decree in Calvinism, but they also use it here whenever we're talking about the called for irresistible grace as well.
Yeah.
Neither of those.
And it's also used in 1 Corinthians 1, whenever it talks about the foolishness of those who are perishing, but then it goes on down but for those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And they'll use that term called there from Paul as to say but for those effectually called is basically what they're reading in that. Those irresistibly graced is what they're reading into that word. But when you understand it in the Pauline sense, it's just simply saying for those who are named, or those who I've named as my own from both the Greeks and the Jews and the Gentiles, then it makes perfect sense from the Pauline use of the word called as in named. And a good English equivalent to this would be like the word recruit. You call somebody a recruit who has been recruited. It doesn't mean that the recruiters didn't try to recruit other people. It just simply means that you call them recruits because the recruitment was successful, and now they're named recruits. So in the same way, you might call someone a called out one. Same in the ministry. We've often referred to people as called out ones if they're called into ministry. It doesn't mean that God didn't call anybody else into ministry that is refusing to the calling. It just simply says we're naming them the called ones. Why? Because they came in response to his calling of them. And just in the same way, you'd call somebody a recruit who came in response to the recruitment. And so that's just an English equivalent or a way of understanding the way Paul may use that term called, and it not necessarily mean this concept of irresistible grace or effectual calling.
Yeah. Amen. And that's why going off of those rabbit trails, you're going outside of Paul's point, I think. But that's what theological debates are for. But
that's what systematic theologies do. That's what confessions do.
Yeah, sometimes or most of the time.
Well, and systematic theology in general gets a bad rap because of those abuses. I think there is some value in systematic theology, being a systematic theologian myself. So I understand the angst against systematic theology because of the many mistakes that it does when it tends to eisegete in order to support a particular systematic. But I think the value of systematizing shouldn't be the baby with the bathwater kind of thrown out, all the benefits that can come with systematic theology. I just think when it's closely married to exegetical and dependent upon exegetical commentary versus the other way, and that's oftentimes the mistake is people approach it from the systematic as the primary, not the exegetical as primary. If you approach it exegetically as primary and then allow that to inform your systematic, I think it can be a lot healthier and actually beneficial. That's just a little soapbox for me because I know some people are really hard on systematic theology because of that.
I'm not.
I recommend Adam Harwood's systematic theology. By the way,
he attempts to, he tries to do some more than just a passing verse reference. When he has a point he wants to make, he does a little bit of exegesis and biblical theology and systematic theology. So I think we've beaten called to death. I think we're all on board with the name designate kind of thing. There's someone in the made a comment that I put up there about the two different things, doctrine of salvation and predestination, not the same. And I think he's a Calvinist, but I want to point out to my friend here, my Calvinist friend, that while I agree with you, you're not going to have if you want to call this the golden chain of redemption, I'm fine with that. Actually, I don't, Braxton's clickbaity title or thumbnail aside, but golden chain and redemption. But what this is not is a golden chain of individual conversion from non-Christianity to Christianity. And that's what people mean by golden chain of redemption is golden chain of individual conversion. But it's plural all throughout. He's talking about the eschatological people of God all throughout, and lumping in the Old Testament saints as a part of also being a part of that, as how we can know that God from beginning to end has been faithful to this and why we can have hope. And in this passage that's filled with assurance, and it's an assurance passage starting in verse, go back to 22 even, but 31 through 39 is all about assurance. not quite as much assurance as some people would want to go if you're an eternal security advocate. But we'll get there. But justified, I mean, go back to all of our shows starting when we were talking about Romans chapter 2, or actually even chapter 1, but really got into what justification is. This is the same as that, declare righteous, and those he declared righteous, which is something that happened to Old Testament saints as well. He also glorified, and again, I want to go back to something I had mentioned earlier. He glorified them. He didn't just merely glorify a body after he talked about naming people and justifying people and foreknowing people and calling people and predestining people to a specific end. He also glorified them. The glory will be revealed to the children of God that is going to be revealed in them. He's glorified them, meaning highly honored, highly esteemed. This is doxa language, is glory, is honorific language in the honor-shame dynamics of the ancient Mediterranean world. This is encouragement to those who are suffering at the time of this letter, what I would say is probably more of a milder form of persecution than the subsequent decade of when Romans was written. But still, some levels of social persecution happening. There is suffering that's genuine and that they're dealing with in the present. And he's saying, guess what? Your honor status in all of this is off the charts. Co-heirs with the King of Kings, Jesus. You're going to rule with him over the new heavens, the new earth, the new creation that's waiting to be set free. You are going to be highly honored. This is a place of preeminence. This is a place of above and beyond your wildest imaginations of what your status is in comparison to where these people in Rome probably think that their station in life not very high at first century Rome. These are probably little home churches, probably either former slaves or still current slaves. They don't think of themselves, but these people are the ones that God highly honors. And so that's important to think about, especially when you take the flowers interpretation, as we're calling it tonight, that is exactly what God has done to the Old Testament saints, to the remnant that Paul will get into, to the author of Hebrews talks about the Hall of Faith. And there's some questionable characters in there, even in my opinion, that are still highly honored. So that's kind of how I see verse 30. But Derek, did you want to chime in with something?
I just liked how 4 lines said it sweetly and succinctly. Predestination in verse 29 is the same as verse 30.
Yeah.
Or verse 30 is the same as verse 29. So in other words, saying the glorification has to do with the being conformed to his image. It is not you are predestined to become a Christian.
Right. You are not. This is not about predestining non-Christians to convert to Christianity over the course of human history. That's not what Paul's on about here, which is so far off from like his, point in writing Rome. But anyway, so Nick's questions here. What of the integral human agency and Paul's rhetoric throughout Romans chapter 8? Well, Nick personally, and I tend to agree, hinges a lot on synergism, which is a word that Paul actually uses here in this chapter. And I think that there's a lot of, if you put to death, if you by the Spirit put to death the deeds of the flesh, you will live. If you do all of these things, and it's because of all of these things that you have this hope, and here's this bit of encouragement that whatever you're going through now is incomparable to, a little bit of theodicy here, not comparable to the glory that's going to be revealed, and all of that. I do think that there is a working together. There is a synergistic, and I don't think all Calvinists are like against all forms of synergistic cooperation. They just think that it's all deterministic or compatibilistic or whatever. But I think independent of our Calvinist, non-Calvinist debates, they don't have a problem with any sort of synergistic participation, participatory language within their own context and how they flesh that out. So I don't know that there's too much to object here from them other than the specific theological readings of Romans 28 through 30. But I see human agency, cooperation, synergism all throughout this entire chapter.
Even if you want to talk about synergy and the concept of working with someone, you could even make the argument God is working with Pilate or Judas in order to bring about the redemption of humanity. And it's not about him determining Judas to be Judas and to be bad and to be rebellious, or Pilate to do evil things. It's about him using evil people and their evil intentions, knowing what they are in a given circumstance, to bring about a good purpose through their evil deeds. And so that even fits the synergy of the theodicy concepts of saying God can, because of his sovereignty and his power and his might, he's able to work with even evil creatures, Satan himself, to bring about his good purposes and work out his good by redeeming their evil things and the things they do, not determining the evil things they do, because that would make him guilty and culpable for those things if he's ultimately the one who's causing them or the decisive cause of their evil decisions. But instead, knowing their evil decisions and using them to bring about his good purpose, again, that fits perfectly with this synergistic concept. And so it's not just about him synergistically working with the beloved and those who love him and are called according to his purpose for a good end. It's also God working even out. He's working out even the evil that happens within our world to bring about his purposes and his plans.
Well, I agree with that theologically. I don't think that's really what.
That's not what it's about. I mean, that's not. I don't think that's what he's addressing either. But you can make that argument using the Acts, 2 and 4 arguments about God determining Pilate and Judas to do what they did, all those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
If you're systematically using all of these proof texts all over the place, we can concede with the Calvinist.
Yeah.
That concept of God working with Judas or working with Satan or working with Pilate, in the sense that he's not determining the things they do, but redeeming
he's in the
that
midst
which they do
of all
for
of
good.
that. Yeah, absolutely. Now, Old Testament saints or Christians, I think that I'm a both and here, but I think that the point of the Old Testament saints is that I think the Old Testament saints are the foreknown ones. I just also like the translation. He also to rope them into what's going to be happening to Paul's audience, and therefore also us as well. So yes, Old Testament saints are in view here as they are lumped in, and I don't know how that works with dispensationalism. I haven't been a dispensationalist in 20 plus years. I don't know if they'll like that, but covenant theologians can at least agree with that. So I'm kind of a both and, but the foreknew is why we know. Verse 28, we know. Why do we know? Because those who God foreknew in the past, prior to Paul's writing, are also lumped into this program. If you want to call it a golden chain of redemption, fine, but that has nothing to do with individual conversion.
Or if you want to call it foreloved, fine.
Yeah.
In other words, that does not contend with our position. It
right.
only contends
it has nothing
with
whatever to do with predestining individuals in eternity past to go from non-Christianity to Christianity at some point in the human history timeline.
Right.
This has nothing to do with any of that. So it's a golden chain of redemption in one sense, or it's a golden chain and redemptive stuff. But yeah. So that's where I'm at on that. Soteriological determinism. In the 1800s, they invented the word monergism to counter the word synergism. Monergism is a made-up word from 200 years ago to counter a word that we find in the very passage we're reading. Synergism.
Mm-hmm.
Working together with. So absolutely no determinism, soteriological determinism, no monergism. If by monergism you mean the monergistic work of God to convert a non-Christian to Christian. Now, I am very happy, not with determinism, but I'm very happy with monergism. If by monergism you mean, God is the subject of these verbs, this is a misconception that because we're synergists in terms of going from non-Christianity to Christianity, non-Calvinists actually are monergist if you think in terms of, okay, so God is the only actor who predestines his eschatological people to anything. God is the only one who justifies. People don't justify themselves. God is the only agent that can, preserve your soul in the presence of Christ when your body dies. God is the only one who can put your soul into a resurrected, imperishable, heavenly body at the eschaton. Okay? So we're monergists in all of that. God justifies.
Mhm.
God gives us new bodies. God gives us the Holy Spirit. We can't make the Spirit come inside us, by our own free. We're monergists on all of that. So I don't even think that that's appropriate to say.
Well, and I think even Dan Chapa makes the argument that Calvinists are actually the ones who are denying monergism, because many of them are arguing inconsistently by saying that if faith is of us, then we would be, in a sense, saving ourselves.
Yeah.
And so so we're the ones saying that faith isn't what causes our salvation. God causes us to be saved.
Right.
Who does he cause to be saved? Those who believe. And so believing something or putting your trust in, in the king, the patriarch, or whoever you're putting your trust in, doesn't do anything if that patriarch doesn't the reciprocity. It's that unless he chooses to honor you, glorify you, lift you up, it doesn't do anything. And that's the patriarch. That is the king's decision alone. Yeah. And so when the son returns home to the patriarch, he doesn't have to restore him. Nothing's forcing him to restore him. He chooses to do so because of his grace, because of his goodness. He chooses to do so monergistically, in the sense that it's only the father's choice to do that. Just the fact that the son comes home doesn't cause that to be synergistic, as if the son coming home somehow synergistically caused the father to do what he does. And that's where it sometimes get confused, I think, among the different arguments that are being made, because people paint it as if you have a decision in the matter, or if you're responsible for putting your trust in Christ, and that's your decision, not ultimately God's, then somehow God's not really the one saving you. You're actually saving yourself, and that's obviously
because I'm a monergist on a lot of things and a synergist on some things, depending on what we're talking about. Some Calvinists are monergists from start to finish. Some
sanctification monergist. Yeah, sanctification monergist.
Yeah. Some Calvinists are actually synergists when it comes to sanctification, but they're monergists when it comes to an individual's conversion from non-Christianity to Christianity, which is something Paul doesn't even care about. Sorry, there is no ordo salutis anywhere for an individual conversion anywhere in Paul. Paul's not interested in that. Even if you rush to Luke and you go to Luke and says, "Oh, Paul talking to the jailer, what must I do to be saved?" And you take that to mean, what Christians mean. Paul says, "Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved." And doesn't in the sentence there, he goes on to say, "You and your household will be saved if he does a thing." Weird. But so Paul's even there in the one example that's written by Luke, you can't find Paul interested in how a individual goes from non-Christianity to Christianity in conversion. That's just not something Paul's particularly in. Paul is about communities of worship and stuff, but there's certainly nothing about that here. But some Calvinists are monergistic in conversion. I'm not, and I don't see the point in being. That's just weird.
Well, so much of this just comes down to how they're defining the words. That it's like, I guess I'm a monergist in the respect that God does all the work of redemption. There you go. So, but I'm a synergist that, there has to be a choice made. Like, you have to believe.
Right. In conversion and in sanctification, there's cooperation. There's working together with all of that as well. So what is the subject we're talking about? Like, I'm with you, monergism the whole way through. I mean, I kind of agree with Calvin's reading of Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. But even there, if I don't take Calvin's reading, and I think that faith is the gift, specifically, like an individual's faith, which I don't see that in the passage, but I think faith is a gift anyway. In what sense is it a gift? It's a gift that by grace you are saved through faith, and it's not of yourselves, is a gift because God could require works instead of not of works, or God could require faith plus standing on your leg for 5 minutes every morning and then prays 6 times a day at specific times, or God could make all sorts of things. But no, it's a gift. It's, again, patronage language, that God operates salvation in this way as opposed to another way.
So you don't see it as God giving you this metaphysical thing called faith.
Yeah, faith is not a necktie that is transferred from one party to another. It's not like you can just hand somebody something. So
I like to use the analogy, Jonathan, of like an app on your phone. Like your phone doesn't have the capacity to do this function unless you download the app. And if you download the app, then the iPhone can do this function. And so a lot of people think of faith as this downloaded app, that you can't do it unless you've downloaded this app. And God has to be the one who downloads this app into those he's elected from eternity past. And then now they have this functionability. And it's a lot simpler than that. It's allegiance. You can put your allegiance into Muhammad or into science. You can put your allegiance into a lot of different kings or principles or ideas. The thing that gets allegiance power is not the allegiance itself, but it's in the one in whom you place your allegiance.
Right.
So if you place your allegiance to a king with power, then that allegiance is powerful because of the one in which you put your allegiance towards, your trust in.
But you and I both agree with Calvin's reading of the passage anyway, that the whole thing, by grace you were saved, by faith, not of works, that itself that it works that way is what the gift is. But even if you wanted to say that faith itself was a gift, we're still got to talk about what is faith in its right categories. And you're right. It's not an app downloaded into us. It is an exercise of believing allegiance or fidelity to a person, and that God requires that and Ephesians is all about we, you, and us, which is Jews, Gentiles, and all of us together, and becoming one new man from the two, and all of that stuff, especially in Ephesians 2, by the way. That's all about how that it works that way is the gift, or that's grace language. By grace you were saved. That's patronage language, that this is what God expects of his people for this kind of redemption that he, put in that really long sentence in the first chapter. That's what that's about.
Yeah, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God.
Exactly.
So
we'll get there too.
He brings by a gift. His gift is to bring his truth, his word, his light, so that we might see. That's his gift. And a gift doesn't have to be irresistibly given in order for the giver to get all the credit for giving his gift. So we can say, yes, faith is a gift in that he came to the Jew first and gave him that gift by bringing the light to the Jew first. And then he brought the gift to the Gentiles second. And that gift is not irresistible, but you're responsible for what you do with the gift. If you receive the light and you walk towards the truth will set you free. If you suppress the truth in unrighteousness, you will remain in bondage. But that's your fault. It's not God's lacking of light or God's lacking of desire for you. And I think that has to be emphasized so much, because ultimately the alternative reading puts blame back onto God, basically by saying he really didn't give them a gift. They're really not rejecting anything. They're just doing exactly what they were pre-ordered to do from eternity past. And that removes their blameworthiness. Yeah.
As far as perseverance of the saints and once saved, always saved, I'm going to skip all that because we're going to talk that to death next week. And can such divine activity be resisted, lost, or ignored? Well, we talked about that last week, so we don't need to go there either. Everyone should just go watch last week's episode if they missed it. But of course, I'm not in the once saved, always saved camp. Like I said last week, divine activity can be resisted and therefore lost. I don't know what Nick meant by ignored. You'll have to ask him. But yeah, let's get to the practical application stuff with where the rubber meets the road. This is what we always do at the end of the show. If this is your first show because you bought our clickbait where we were going to talk about, and this is the kind of thing I want our new viewers who bought into the clickbait to understand. There are a lot of options to understand the book of Romans that have nothing to do with Calvinism. So for all the people saying, why don't you have a Calvinist on? You'll find out next week, or not next week, but well, maybe next week with the one, if we have any eternal security people. But when we get to Romans 9, Dr. Flowers and I don't even agree on every verse of Romans 9. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can talk about with the book of Romans that have nothing to do with Calvinists. We just
Well,
like
and
to pick on
having read so many Calvinists, you know this as well as anybody, Jonathan. Every Calvinist disagrees over some aspect of Romans 9.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, you read Schreiner versus something that Dunn has said. You see a lot of different perspectives, even among some of the Calvinistic reading.
Well, Calvinist, well, Schreiner versus Wright. Dunn's
No, or Moo. I was thinking.
Moo. Yeah, they
Moo would be a
differ.
good example, right?
They differ on different texts, and their overall readings. Moo tries to walk a line, because he has to maintain.
It's funny. I'll read some of the stuff, and I'm going, "Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. That's right." But then he'll go, "But still," and then he'll insert some.
Well, he's at
qualifying statement.
Yeah.
Of, Calvinistic theology.
People forget. I mean, he's at Wheaton, so he has to maintain legitimacy. If you're at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary like Schreiner, it's all Calvinists. You have no one to come into your office, a fellow colleague on campus, to say, "What is?" Bruce Ware, I call them the non-dynamic duo, Ware and Schreiner over there at Southwestern, or
Southern, yeah.
I'm just, they're just not very dynamic, but they're like two peas in a pod. They're like always linking up. But I mean, really, there's nobody to challenge them on a day-to-day basis. Like, I can't believe you said that. Whereas Moo's got to be a little bit more, so that's why. But I mean, like I said, to Schreiner's credit, at least he's fair to the people he's trying to refute, and so fair to the point that you were like, why don't you agree with them? Because you defended their position better than your own. But anyway, there's so much to talk about that has nothing to do with Calvinism. But talking about Calvinism has made Leighton Flowers very successful. So we always talk about it here on this channel so that we can share in his success. Hence, we have his face on our on our thumbnail.
Yeah,
all right.
I had nothing to do with that, by the way. Just for the record, I had nothing to do with the thumbnail.
Not my face. You put a guy on there who didn't even show up.
I know what you would say about this passage in a video because you've made hundreds of videos that reference this passage. But you are in a church on Sunday morning or in a small group. What are you focusing on when you explain this passage? Whether you reference Calvinism or not, what are you talking about when you get to this passage?
We talking about Romans 8, the passage we're discussing.
Tonight.
Yeah. Like I said at the very beginning, when I said let's simplify this, it's talking about the saints that have been called according to His purpose, and that despite your suffering, that you're groaning, that you're going through, the struggle that you're having in your life. That God will work all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. He will bring good out of that suffering. He will redeem whatever the bad is that you're suffering through right now. He's going to bring about His purpose and His plan, even through that suffering and that struggle. And how do we know that? Well, look at those formerly loved by God. Look at those formerly called by God. Look at those who are formerly called according to His purpose and who love God. They were predestined to be conformed into the image of Christ, who would become the firstborn of many brethren. And look what He did for them. He called them, He justified them, He glorified them. This is all a part of what God determined beforehand would happen for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. So now we can rest assured, because He did it for David, because He did it for Moses, because He did it for those He formerly knew, we can know that He'll do that for us. So we can rest in assurance that whatever suffering we're going through, He's going to bring about His good purposes and His plan through that. And so it gives us a great amount of assurance. It gives us a great amount of understanding of how God has worked and how He will work with us, because we can see how He's continually been there for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
You break it down so well. For the
well, notice I didn't have to get into any esoteric, weird language of this and that, and God looking through corridors of time, or God foreknowing, predestining, all these kinds of things of Him predestining every molecule and the rogue molecules, and this concept of time before time existed, and this before all of creation, God, determining what you would be and do and fating your life. None of that stuff has to come into it, because that's not with the flow of the text. It's like maybe Derek, you pointed out earlier, it would be just this weird thing for him to be talking about moaning of creation and all the things going on, and all of a sudden interject this concept and idea that's never been seen before throughout all of the scripture teaching of this concept and idea of the Ordo Salutis and the redemption of every single human, from before creation. It would totally and completely just be like this huge shift in subject and everything else to even get there, which is why I think you mockingly put it even after it being about Star Wars or something like that, because it seems so absurd when you look at it from an objective perspective.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So no haggling over dative and no haggling over substantive participles in your presentation, like me and Nick went on for a better part.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really I'm interested in that. Some people's eyes may glaze over. I really kind of like hearing all of those different arguments from the linguists in the room. And so I'd love Joel to be here with you guys and bantering with y'all, because I'm so not that, obviously.
Yeah.
That's not my forte.
Well, my thing with that is I want Tim Barber and Nick Quint and the NIV Study Bibles alternative reading. I want that to be true, and contextually I see, but I want a grammatical argument that can shut down the grammar Nazis, because I'm not but maybe the grammar Nazis can shut it down and say you're reading too much into it contextually without it.
I guess in some ways I'm more of a New Living Translation commentator, or Message Translation commentator. I'm trying to get the main idea. Like, what is the main concept that's in Paul's mind as he's going through this? What's he talking about?
Somebody
obviously getting into the textual variants and the different things help us to make sure we're right about those main ideas. And so we need those discussions, but I like to break it down in the simplest way, which is probably why I maybe connect with people. I think that's why Sproul was so popular, because he really did break it down in really low level argumentation, and sometimes very bad argumentation, as you've put it, but he made things very understandable from the Calvinistic perspective, and I think that's one of the reasons he became very popular. And so people could say what they want, but I tend to dumb things down because I'm not so bright myself, and I have to.
The pseudo humility is so annoying.
No, it's not pseudo. I know myself. Just
you know stuff. I agree with the meme that Drew made where you are smart but you sound dumb.
Well, the Texan. Well, that's the thing is, you calling it the flowers view kind of makes my eyes roll, because these are, obviously things that haven't originated by any means. And that's why I cite so many different scholars in my book, but they're not real big name guys like many of the ones that are today. And that's I think the issue with the popularity contests that happen within the theological arguments online.
Yeah. You will find gold in the journals. You will find it's all about who gets book deals and for books. It's not about, are they really getting the best? Do we actually need another contemporary Romans commentary written by a Calvinist? No, we actually need, if you're going to have that many, you need a ton of non-Calvinist commentaries just for balance, because there's already probably way too many commentaries, but there's also, it seems like these series editors say, well, it's we got to get the Calvinists to write the Romans commentary in this series, and they do it every time. So it's just obnoxious. So it really has nothing to do with level of scholarship. It has who gets the deal. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have to be famous to be right.
Mm-hmm.
But
well,
yeah,
and often cases throughout history, it's usually the ones who are in the minority, and oftentimes their stuff is burned at the stake and everything else, that are actually the more humble and the kinder, and then they're not resorting to violence in order to argue their points. If you study Christian history, the theological bullies are typically the more, and this is also true in other religions. The theological bullies tend to be deterministic. It happens in the Islamic tradition as well. that they tend to be the ones who kill everybody that disagrees with them. And so you can get this concept and idea in your mind looking back over Christian history that this is the most popular perspective, and therefore it must be the right one. Look at all these great minds that have thought this way. But the truth is, Calvinism, when looked at all of Christian history, is a very minority view, and very much in the minority, and is not, in my estimation, the best representation of scholarship among Christians, and for obvious reasons. And I think that that's objectively true, not just a subjective opinion on my part. I think that can actually be demonstrated through evidence.
Yeah. Derek, you're teaching this to your small group. What are you hitting home?
I would, well, first of all, I want to say you're welcome, Pritchett, for this being the by far highest viewed live stream we've had in Biblical Rogues Gallery. Leighton shared the link, but I shared a screenshot with the link, and my post got more views that way because I played the algorithm. So I think it was an effort, but
you are a master at the Twitter, the X, formerly known as whatever we're calling it these days. You are a master at that, because so maybe hopefully some of the people who are more interested in your political stuff than your theological stuff will tune in and get interested in theology because it's more interesting than politics. So hopefully some of those folks found their way here. And hopefully they'll find their way here when we get to Romans chapter 13, because that'll be fun too.
Yeah. So I think me and Leighton are the reason that there's so many Calvinists in the chat this time around. But if I were to teach this, I would have to start by, well, I wouldn't necessarily start by this, but as Leighton said earlier, predestination is not something with all this esoteric baggage. It's pretty straightforward when you understand it in its original context. It's not esoteric. It's not crazy metaphysical. It is to decide beforehand, right? So to lead up to this passage, I would kind of reiterate what we talked about previously in Romans 8. So as I mentioned earlier, you have up to 17 where you're talking about the Holy Spirit's work in our lives, and then verse 17 mentions glorification, and then Paul goes from that in verse 18 to talk about the present suffering and the future glory while he's on the topic of glorification. And he goes point by point in the hope that we have that there's present suffering, that the creation's groaning, we're groaning, the Spirit is groaning with us, and that leads into verse 28 where verse 28, whenever we're talking about the present suffering in the context, we know that all things work together for the good. I probably won't get hung up on you and Nick's debate, but because I think the point is still there as far as what I would teach it, is that we know these things. We know that God works things for good. How do we know it? Because Paul is doing what we've seen done, like in the Old Testament. Psalm 77 is my favorite example, so I keep bringing that up. Looking back at how God has operated in the past. In the case of Psalm 77, he looked back at the Exodus. He said, I will remember the God of old and what he had done. He's talking about the Exodus. In this case right here, Paul is establishing that we know God works all things for good because we look back at how God was working with his people. Those are the ones whom he foreknew, the Old Testament saints who God loved. I'm okay with forelove if you want to, define foreknew there as that. But he says he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. So we're talking about the glorification, where Paul has been building this up for several verses now, that it's going to climax in verse 30, where he talks about the predestined. They're predestined to be conformed to his image. He called them, he named them as his people. And then we see that he justified them and he also glorified them. And so when we have our present suffering, we know that God works all things for good because we've seen him do it with his people before. And so we have all this abundant reason for the hope that is in us. And then I would loop in as much as I could that made sense the different, many different references to our hope that Paul has in his theology and in his corpus of the New Testament, because there's a lot to be said about glorification and our hope there, but Paul really nails it home here. I think in the, you know, the bulk of Romans 8 up to this point is leading up to glorification, because that's where our hope is. We have the suffering, but we have hope for everything to be set right. We're going to be conformed to Christ's image, and we can trust God that he will fulfill this plan because we have seen him do it before.
Amen. As for me, I would probably repeat much of what you two have already said, though I would probably, and Derek, I think you and probably Leighton as well would probably put 26 and 27. Unlike Nick, we'd put those with the prior section. We do 18 all the way through 27 probably, instead of connecting 26 to 27 with 28 through 30. But I would take an extra week just for 28 through 30. I mean, we've talked about we've gone almost 3 hours. We're almost Leighton Flowers Soteriology 101 length here. I would spend a whole week on this. I would recap like you would, probably at least as far back as 18. And then I would go into, I would stress the two options that you have. Neither one of them affect the theological implication of side A or side B, whether you go with the variant or not. I'd mention them because it's interesting to me. I'd say where I lean, which is the side A, because I think it carries over from the earlier part of 18 through 27 about, you know, our place in this with the Spirit, you know, and our life in the Spirit, and our participatory work with God on all these things to bring about this good according to this purpose of God's. I think I would keep the his there, even though it's not in the Greek. I would stress that what is the goal here? Looking back, the Old Testament saints are an example. I'm sure this wouldn't sit well with the dispensationalists if I was teaching this, but they serve an example that they are also fashioned towards this same goal to get us back to the garden in this new creation, and that to being fashioned into the icon of Christ or the image of Christ is to be the co-ruler who does what Adam didn't do, succeeding where Adam failed, and that Jesus is the preeminent one. And I would tease this coming up, this designation, named instead of called. I would tease that. I would tease the firstborn, tease that out about Romans 9, about the secondborn, that the firstborn one came through a lineage of primarily definitely secondborn patriarchs, and then certainly second or more through the kings, because there was this whole program of God of redemption, not golden chain of individual conversion, but golden chain of actual redemption that gets us back to where God had intended it all along with the garden, to be like Christ, so that we can co-rule with Christ in the way that creation is supposed to have been governed by Adam, but Adam failed where Christ succeeded. So that is what the predestination, the designation, that is what the righteous declaration is about. Ultimately, it's more than just acquittal for guilt of sin, but it is to be right-wise, as Nick likes to say, or the apocalyptic crowd likes to say, be made right-wise, so that the righteous stewardship in the eschaton and the new heavens and new earth is carried out by these people that are fashioned to be like Jesus as his siblings and co-heirs. And that wherever you are in your status of life here in this life, whether you're a janitor or a CEO, it is all levelized in the honor that we all have once we reach that Christ likeness, that Christ image, that we are all have that same inheritance. We all have that same vocation. We all have that same honor status in the divine economy, as opposed to the worldly economy. So those are the things that I would highlight here.
Well said. Amen.
Well said. And real quick, I wanted to mention that because I said that I would kind of flesh out predestination in its context without getting into all the metaphysical stuff.
Right.
I don't even know if I would mention the Calvinist debate, Calvinist, non-Calvinist debate behind this, because I think what this passage is, what Paul is driving at is so much more beautiful and more important than that debate. And as you've said before, the Calvinist interpretation is so far off the range that it's almost not even worth, dealing with whenever you're talking in this context of like counseling and teaching, like in a small group, because it's just not even a possibility in my mind so much. So that's why I personally would not get into that debate in a small group.
I think a small group or even the Sunday morning service, I think actually, I think it's okay to bring up these debates, because even if the crowd is not particularly interested in them, it's always good to pique their interest to know that there's a lot out there being said about something. Mm-hmm. And so even if they ended up agreeing with the Calvinist takes or whatever, by letting them know it's out there, I think that's good, because anything that gets people to interested, I think that these debates could be a way to get people to be more theologically interested, because there's, 2 or 3 sides to something, and there's controversy, and it's a hot button issue. And if you let people know that, they might get more interested in the fight. And sure, that's spectacle, but the ultimate goal would be, if you get interested in the spectacle, we know this because all 3 of us have been engaged with this, that how much has it taken us back to the text by being sharpened in our responses to the people with whom we disagree. So I'm not trying to rain on your parade there, Derek.
No.
You're not necessarily wrong, but I don't think that you need to shy away from it if you're worried about it being a distraction, because sometimes you can use that as a way to get people interested. And even if they end up disagreeing with you and siding with the Calvinists or whatever, at least it got them deeper into the Bible instead of Netflix for.
Well, what I've noticed is, like, back when I was a youth pastor, if I were teaching this to a group of 8th graders, for example, I would take Derek's approach, because more than likely they haven't been influenced by the Calvinistic reading because of their age. And so I remember an example of doing that as talking to a group of youth, and I just presented the scripture as I understood it from our perspective. And one of the teachers, other teachers that was in the room, one of the other adults came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, I thought it was this, and this because of the influence that Piper and some other people had on him." But he was the one who was dealing with that because he had already been influenced by the Calvinistic reading in such a way that he needed to grapple with it, where the 8th graders didn't need to grapple with it. And so it oftentimes depends on how much influence, and there's quite a bit of influence, I think we could argue, from the Calvinistic perspective in our world today, because of the influence of people like MacArthur and Piper and others that have been very predominant in getting their message out, whereas the alternatives have not been near as good.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it all depends upon who your audience is. If your audience is 8th graders, you'd be lucky to get their attention for.
Well, as somebody who has like ministered to people who are really new in the faith, even in adult Sunday school class I had to be very, very basic. In that context, that's kind of what I'm talking about. In a sermon, talking to the church, I like what you said, like teasing it out. There is stuff there, and I probably would flesh it out. I mean, come on, you know me on Twitter. You know this isn't a debate that I'm going to shy away from. It's just that right. I think the Calvinist interpretation of this is so dumb that, that it's not worth mentioning unless you have that component to it where it's like I can tease out that there's a further debate to get them into their Bible. I can do that. Yeah. I can agree with that. So I do think it's contextual.
Yeah. See, this might be showing my age. You might have missed this by a decade, Derek, because you're younger. But Flowers, you'll relate to this. It used to be, if you brought up the end times, that was always a good way to get people to start studying the Bible more. If you were going to talk about eschatology, Antichrist, second coming, all of that, that used to be the hot button thing that got people's attention. Post mills are trying to make that the topic again, because I think they're bored with Calvinism, even though a lot of, except for IP and that crowd, but a lot of the post mills are Calvinists, and they're trying to tie that in with their political leanings and all that. They're trying to make eschatology great again, to use a political phrase. But I still think soteriology is the hot button issue that is of this current era, whereas eschatology used to be the hot button ticket item.
Well, I think what's made it the hot button topic is that it is the predominant teaching that's heard in most online settings. I mean, you search these questions, you almost always get, the first 5 or 6 results of being more Calvinistic. And so, yes, I am old.
Yeah.
I'm older than these two gentlemen for sure.
Barely, but barely older
yeah.
than me. We're both a lot older than Derek. We're the old guys. My hair just hadn't gotten as gray as Leighton's yet.
So because it's the predominant view, and there's a lot of people who just have this burr under their saddle, to use a Texas term, when they hear that, it's just like, that just doesn't seem right. God faded, and I use the word faded as it's defined in the dictionary, scripted our decisions in such a way that we could not have willingly done otherwise because of the very nature we were born. What? Are we sure we believe that? Is that what the Bible teaches? And there's a lot of people who are really struggling with that interpretation. So when someone comes along and says, this is the way that it could be understood and has been understood throughout Christian history in many ways from a lot of other great scholars that are not being promoted as well as they should be online, like the Calvinists are, then that's why I think it's a popular topic. It's because of the success of Piper that this is a popular topic, not because this topic in and of itself is just all that interesting necessarily. It's because the most controversial and difficult interpretation is the most predominantly presented and known view. That's what I think makes this such a controversial topic, and one that people are running to find answers from a non-Calvinistic perspective.
Yeah, that was true 10 years ago, but I think since you've started working, I think you can't Google this without coming across Soteriology 101 anymore. I mean, hats off to you.
Praise
God
all
for the work that you have put in. That, I mean, you've even inspired imitators like the Timu version of Soteriology 101 with Drew. And I'm just kidding, Drew. No, you really are the Timu. And what's God, I can't remember. What's his partner's name? Luke,
Eric, and Drew.
Eric. Yeah. No, provisionist perspective. Those guys are great. I love those guys.
No, they are
Eric and Drew. Drew's an open theist though, so he's with Tim and Warren, and they're weirdos. But other than that, they're fine. I can say whatever I want because Warren didn't. He decided to skip again, so
he's not here to defend himself.
Yeah, Tim was supposed to be here, but we were talking about him and his debate, and he didn't show up anything. Anyway, next week we're going to do 31 through 39 and round out Romans chapter 8. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll be getting into Romans 9, which hopefully, even if you take off next week, Leighton, I hope you come back for Romans 9. I hope Dr. Joel will actually show up for once. And whoever else wants to chime in on the Biblical Rogues Gallery that week, they're all welcome. But Romans 9 is going to be a lot of fun. But next week, we're going to do 31 and 39. I think the biggest theological issue is obviously that means eternal security, perseverance of the saints, once saved, always saved. Obviously, it means that. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, period. Even though that's not what Paul says. He says nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. And all those things are external. But I'll let the once saved, always saved people carry their own water. Come back next week so we can hash that whole issue out. It'll be a lot of fun. But anyway, it's a beautiful passage. It's a beautiful passage that gives wonderful assurance to the believer who is in Christ. So we'll see you next week on the Biblical Rogues Gallery. Y'all go subscribe to Soteriology 101 if for some unknown reason you haven't yet. Who hasn't? Only silly people haven't. I mean,
follow Derek. Follow Derek on Twitter too. He's got some.
He's great, and he has a channel, and it's a good channel. Right. He talks about theology and how to stop being overweight. It's kind of fitness / theology.
I think they get better. The mental and the physical.
There you go. And tune into Trinity Radio because the first release for the Trinity Radio Fake Animation Studios drops tomorrow, I think. an old Walter White. Braxton worked so hard on this. He's so proud of it. And he's scared nobody's going to watch it, but I think it is fantastic. It's he put a lot of little details in there, and I want him to do more of them. They're fantastic. So y'all check out that debate. It's an old school Walter Martin debate that's audio only that we animated so that it make it watchable. Braxton put a lot of work in it. It's fantastic. So check that out. And Leighton, you got any videos coming up that people need to be on the lookout for?
There's always new stuff coming out. Caleb does a great job grabbing videos from other broadcasts, like even this one. There'll probably be a 10, 15-minute clip that he'll put on Sociology 101 to let people find answers to specific questions. So I'm really thankful for Caleb when I'm traveling like I am today. I'm not able to do broadcasts, and Caleb is able to put those shorts out. So always having that subscription open and ready to watch. You always have new videos coming out at least weekly. So,
Derek, you got anything good coming up, or just?
Well, either one of you are welcome to have me on your channel at some point.
I know who's supposed to have him on his channel.
I did invite Derek one time. He just was. It was like 30 minutes before I started, though. So to his credit,
yeah,
I didn't give him a lot of leeway.
What are y'all supposed to hash out? Like,
well, yeah, just stuff with I talked with the Method Ministries, Prevenient Grace. I kind of wanted to
Prevenient Grace, whatever that means.
I actually really enjoy that topic. That's one of my more enjoyable topics, just because it's not the normal Calvinism discussion. Right. And so I actually really enjoy having Derek on to kind of hash that out, because that's something I have done a lot of thinking about and writing on, because I think the Augustinian grid that the typical classical Arminian is still on has caused some of the confusion and problems along the way. And I think that clarification with regard to total inability is a huge step in the right direction for a biblical defense for our perspective. And Derek, let's schedule something. I really want to do that.
Because Arminians don't even define prevenient grace the same way. They all have
they all have different definitions.
Like Abbassiano, he for example doesn't make it a metaphysical thing, but yet he talks about it as if it is. So I'm a little confused on his perspective. Whereas other people think that prevenient grace is a metaphysical
partial regeneration. Like Olson.
Like a halfway regeneration that doesn't always necessarily work. This is weird. But yeah, I don't get it. So yeah, that would be great. I'd like to tune in to listen to that. If you'd like to take courses from professors such as myself, Leighton Flowers, Tim Stratton, Braxton Hunter, all the Calvinism Hater Club, I guess, Trinity, or if you want to take courses from people who don't care about that, like Dr. Chatham or Dr. Harkness, or if you want to take classes from Dr. Chris Featherstone in our Christian counseling school. If you're interested in counseling other believers from an integrationist perspective, we have Dr. Chris Featherstone. Go subscribe to his channel on YouTube, Vision United, or subscribe to his other channel that's about pro wrestling, because he also moonlights as a pro wrestling journalist, which is weird. But all kinds of professors that work at Trinity that you've actually heard of at a price that you can afford. So go to trinitysem.edu and fill out an eval today. And with that, we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.